Hey there, welcome to Bread Arrows. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. If these stories give you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I can't claim I was at a rock-bottom moment in my life when the antiquarian came knocking at my door. It would be easy to say I was desperate and emotionally fragile, therefore falling victim to his dark influence. The truth is, I wasn't entirely content with my existence. I had a stable career and a comfortable home, having inherited a substantial sum after my mother's passing. I missed Mom terribly, of course, but I processed my grief as well as I could and carried on. Relationships had always been difficult for me. I'd had romantic partners, but never married, no children. I didn't even have any genuine friends, really plenty of casual acquaintances, but nobody I could confide my deepest thoughts and aspirations to. Still, this social detachment never truly troubled me. Since childhood, I'd always been somewhat introverted and comfortable with solitude, but it was deeper than that. I always sensed that I was fundamentally different from other people, a being who existed among humanity but wasn't truly part of it. I perceived there was something within me that wasn't quite ordinary. For years, I believed this sensation was some form of psychological disorder or the consequence of suppressed childhood trauma. There was so much my mother had never revealed about my origins. In the end, it was the antiquarian who revealed the truth about my lineage. For better or worse, Pandora's box had been opened, and my existence has been transformed forever. My story spans multiple generations and connects our mortal world with realms beyond human understanding. But for me, it all started one peaceful Saturday evening when the mysterious antiquarian appeared at my front door. I only dimly remember what I was occupied with that fateful day. To the best of my memory, I was browsing travel deals on my laptop and drinking a cold beer while a baseball game played in the background. I do recall the irritation I felt when I heard the aggressive pounding on my solid mahogany door, loud enough to be heard over the television and throughout my living room. Saturday evening was my personal time, and I wasn't interested in receiving visitors, especially unexpected ones. I have a Ring doorbell installed, but the visitor chose not to use it, instead hammering on my door with excessive force. I shook my head in annoyance as I opened the app on my phone, only to discover that I couldn't access the camera feed. I suppose I should have been concerned by this chain of events, but in that moment I was more frustrated than anything else, particularly as the knocking persisted and grew louder. I set my laptop aside, paused the game, and got to my feet, stomping down the hallway as the pounding continued. All right, I'm coming, damn it," I shouted. I was still furious as I turned the handle and opened the door, preparing to give the unwanted visitor a piece of my mind. But all my anger simply evaporated as soon as I laid eyes upon him. It's challenging for me to explain the impact of seeing the antiquarian for the first time. He was not a particularly striking or attention-grabbing individual. In fact, he appeared as a small and physically frail elderly man, his body hunched over, his hair silver white and skin deeply lined. He wore a musty-smelling tweed jacket and bow tie, supporting himself with a carved walking cane in one hand, while carrying a weathered leather satchel in the other. My visitor displayed a charming, but somehow unsettling smile on his weathered lips, and his gray eyes were illuminated with the passion and vitality of a much younger man. I didn't find him threatening at first glance, far from it. Before the antiquarian even uttered a word, I found myself relaxed in his presence and no longer annoyed by his intrusion upon my evening. I'd never encountered this man before, yet he seemed remarkably familiar to me, like he was a long-lost family member who'd suddenly and unexpectedly returned to my life. I struggled to find the words to address the old man, eventually stammering my greeting. "Hello, can I help you?" The visitor's smile broadened as he spoke in a friendly yet somehow chilling voice. "Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance." He extended his bony hand, which I grasped after only a moment's hesitation. I expected his palm to be ice cold and was surprised by the warmth of his skin, feeling like a surge of energy had passed from his body to mine. "My name is Dr. Ashford, and I am a dealer in rare books and manuscripts. I believe my collection will be of great interest to an intelligent and open-minded gentleman such as yourself. If you have the time, I would love to come inside and tell you more." My hand was still in his as I looked into his deep gray eyes, seeing a glimmer of malice in them for the first time. I experienced a wave of emotions in that moment, curiosity and wonder, but also apprehension and more than a hint of fear. I don't know how exactly, but I realized that the decision I made in the next moment would define the rest of my life. I could tell the mystery man to leave and return to my quiet life of ignorance. On the other hand, I could invite him inside and hear what he had to say. And of course, I chose the latter. "Sure, come in," I said nervously. The antiquarian, Dr. Ashford, or whoever he really was, released my hand, continuing to smile as he nodded his head and walked across the threshold. I moved to one side, allowing him to pass, and watched as he slowly proceeded down the hardwood-floored hallway, his walking cane clicking as he went. I meant to call out to him and direct my visitor where to go, but bizarrely, it seemed like he already knew his way around my home, as he immediately walked into the living room, leaving me to follow him inside. Now, before I continue my account, I should explain a couple of things. First of all, I know very well that Dr. Ashford wasn't really an antiquarian book dealer. Apart from anything else, the profession is nearly obsolete in this modern age of online shopping and instant digital access to information. Secondly, I did realize my visitor was potentially dangerous, although not in the conventional sense. Dr. Ashford was not physically imposing, and I thought it unlikely he was armed. He might be a con artist, of course, but I sensed his interest in me came from something deeper. I cautiously followed him into the living room, noting how he'd already taken a seat in the far corner. He raised his hand, pointing at the couch opposite while saying, "Please, sir, take a seat." It was as if our roles were now reversed, and I was a guest in my own home. And yet I obeyed his instructions without question, taking a seat while I watched him open his weathered satchel. It was only later that I realized all the electronic devices in the room. My television, laptop, and smartphone were all now switched off, their screens turned black. Even then, I didn't understand the significance of why this had occurred. I continued watching in fascination as the antiquarian pulled out a fine leather-bound crimson book from his satchel, holding it so carefully as if it was his most treasured possession. I was instantly drawn to the mysterious book, which my visitor held in his weathered hands. The cover was unremarkable, a deep red color without any design or title that I could see. The pages were all stained yellow, which gave an indication of its age, and it had that rather pleasant musty smell you get in old bookstores or university libraries. I'd like to claim that the cover was made from dried human skin or covered by some kind of mystical symbols, but there was nothing that dramatic. The book itself looked very ordinary, and yet I couldn't look away from it, somehow sensing that the words contained within were of great importance. "Behold, sir, the greatest ledger ever written," the antiquarian suddenly announced, drawing my attention back to his grinning, weathered face and bright eyes. "All the answers you will ever need are contained within these pages." I frowned, looking again at the book and noting its thickness. I estimated it was around 500 to 600 pages in length, which hardly seemed substantial given the claims the antiquarian was making. So this is what you're selling?" I asked cynically. The antiquarian laughed jovially, shaking his head before replying, "No, sir, I'm afraid not. This book is priceless and sadly not for sale." I scowled, becoming increasingly suspicious of my enigmatic visitor. "You said you were a dealer," I snapped back. "I did," he replied, seemingly picking up on my increasing hostility. "The truth is, I have held many positions over the years: teacher, historian, messenger, dealer. In all cases, the common thread is storytelling." I scoffed dismissively before saying, "So what, you're here to tell me a story?" "Oh yes, sir," he beamed with enthusiasm as he began to open the cover. "I can tell you many stories. This wonderful book is full of them." "I see," was my cynical reply. "Let me ask you something, old man. Have you ever heard of Wikipedia?" I was being deliberately sarcastic, of course, challenging the antiquarian's assertion that his book contained sought-after answers, when I could literally access all the information in the world with the mere touch of a finger. The mysterious Dr. Ashford looked confused for a moment, as if my question made no sense to him, but eventually he caught on and answered in his typical jovial manner. "Oh, you mean the World Wide Web? Well, sir, I'm afraid I'm something of a technophobe, but let me assure you, sir, the tales within these pages will not appear on your internet." He paused briefly to let this sink in. I might have laughed aloud at his audacious claim, but there was doubt in my mind. I glanced towards my phone, laptop, and television, noting how all of them had switched off as soon as the antiquarian entered my home. This couldn't be a coincidence, and the implication sent a chill down my spine. The antiquarian didn't seem to notice my change in demeanor, however, as he was engrossed in his precious ledger, carefully and lovingly turning the pages, his eyes lighting up as they scanned the contents. Such was the power of the words contained within. "Now, let's see what story would be of interest to you, good sir. Perhaps the tragic saga of Edmund Cross and his exile to the legendary Isle of Shadows." He flicked through the pages before offering another suggestion. "Or shall I tell you about the rules of the Shadowlands, where the damned stand in line between heaven and hell, while they await the Almighty's judgment?" He turned another page, looking up from the book as he shot me a twisted grin and a sly wink. "But let's not beat around the bush, good sir. I know the story you wish to hear, the story of you, your past, your present, and of course, your future." I snorted again, but with less confidence than before. I still thought he was full of crap, but doubts were creeping into my mind. I tried to make a joke out of it, but my voice was trembling when I asked my next question. "You've got a chapter about me in there." The antiquarian's smile faded somewhat, as did the spark in his eyes, as his energy seemed to diminish. "Yes," he said in a more solemn tone. "You, sir, have a very prominent role in my book." He proceeded to read me my full name and date of birth, along with detailed information about my early life and education. I raised an eyebrow in suspicion. Of course, these were details he could have obtained through several sources, and on the surface, the whole thing seemed like a scam. But there was more. The antiquarian was somehow able to confirm my date of birth, which he claimed to be July 13th, 1966. I laughed nervously at this revelation before saying, "So you're a fortune teller as well as a storyteller?" "Oh no, I cannot tell the future. I merely go by what's in the book, but it's never been wrong yet." I took a deep breath to compose myself once I realized my body was physically shaking with anticipation. The whole situation was insane, and my logical brain told me that none of this could be true. And yet, I truly trusted the mysterious antiquarian at that moment. I don't know whether he'd bewitched me with his dark magic, or because deep down I'd always yearned for this self-validation. But at this point, I was hanging on his every word. "What else does this book say about me?" I demanded impatiently. But the antiquarian didn't answer. Instead, he looked up from his sacred text and towards the mantelpiece on the far side of the living room. He slowly lifted his right hand and pointed towards the framed picture which took center place. "Your mother?" he asked in a sympathetic tone. I looked at the picture, seeing my mom's smiling face and sparkling eyes. I experienced a pang of grief as I remembered how much I missed her. I wondered why my visitor had changed the subject and felt frustrated with his lack of answers. "She never told you about your father, did she?" I paused momentarily, confused by the question, but also feeling like he'd hit a raw nerve. "She did," I answered defensively. "My father died shortly before I was born." The antiquarian shot me a sympathetic half-smile. "That's not true though, is it? You've always known this deep down, but you couldn't bring yourself to confront your mother, not even when she lay on her deathbed." I swallowed deeply, trying to control the flood of emotions I was experiencing. The antiquarian allowed me a moment to process these feelings before he continued to speak. "You wish to know your future, but before you do, you must understand where you come from. Tell me everything." His reaction surprised me as the antiquarian frowned, his smile disappearing as his expression darkened. "I think not, sir. I came here with honest intentions, but now I see you are not ready for the truth." My jaw dropped in astonishment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and stated as much angrily. "No, you can't leave me hanging like this. I must know. I will leave you with two names, Marcus Gray and Olivia Baker." "Who the hell are they?" I shot back in anger and confusion. "You have the names. Seek them out and hear their stories. Piece by piece, the truth shall be revealed to you. But for now, sir, I will wish you good day and good luck." With that, the antiquarian carefully stood up from his seat and slowly walked towards the door. I was literally baffled, not believing that our bizarre encounter could end like this. I had a rush of blood to my head, deciding I could not let him leave without obtaining the answers I needed so badly. In an instant, I jumped up from the couch, reaching for the elderly antiquarian and grabbing him firmly by the arm. "No, old man," I cried furiously. "You're not leaving. I want to read what's inside that damn book." I didn't expect much resistance from the elderly man, and was astonished when he reacted violently, exerting a near superhuman strength as he pulled free from my grasp, and physically shoved me to the floor. I looked up fearfully, seeing the antiquarian transformed into something monstrous, his eyes black and his mouth opening to reveal a gaping dark void. He hissed at me like a serpent, and when he spoke, his words were deep and almost inhuman. "Damn it, sir." I froze in terror, averting my eyes from his hideous second face. "Do not test me. Lay your hands on me again, and you will live to regret it." I didn't need to be told twice, remaining on the floor as the antiquarian left the room, his satchel and walking cane in hand as he slowly walked down the corridor. I heard the door slam shut, and my heart sank because I knew that this bizarre encounter had changed my life forever. You won't be surprised to learn that I was gripped by a frantic obsession following the antiquarian's visit. I tried to track him down, searching and contacting every bookstore and antique shop in a 100-mile radius, all to no avail. I could not find the mysterious Dr. Ashford or his unidentified ledger, no matter how hard I tried. And so all I had to work with were the two names he'd provided me. It's no exaggeration to say that I spent months attempting to track down Marcus Gray and Lluvia Baker. Despite the antiquarian's distrust of the internet, I used this resource extensively during my long and frustrating search. Obviously, there are thousands of individuals on social media with these names, and I had no additional information such as their ages or geographical locations. I quickly realized it was pointless contacting random people online, and my best bet was targeting forums, which specifically dealt with bizarre and supernatural occurrences. Even then, I faced many frustrations and dead ends, but eventually I was able to find the correct Marcus and Lluvia among the host of trolls and scammers. How could I be sure, you ask? Well, both had received their own visits from the enigmatic Dr. Ashford, and were able to confirm details about the same antiquarian and his precious ledger without being prompted by me. I was therefore confident that all three of us shared the same, probably supernatural experience, having been picked out by the ghoulish antiquarian for whatever reason. It's possible that all three of them were in it together, and I was their mark. I did consider the possibility that it was all an elaborate hoax, but for what purpose? I also did my own independent research on the two individuals, and I'm sure they checked me out too. By all accounts, Marcus and Lluvia were unremarkable people who didn't stand out from the crowd. This was my first impression, at least. There was no obvious connection between the three of us. I won't reveal where I live, but I can provide some details about my companions. Lluvia Baker lives in Chicago, having been born and raised in the Windy City. Her mother was Irish-American, and her father was Italian-American. Lluvia wasn't married and had no kids. She didn't even own a pet, as far as I knew. She worked in data analysis and had few friends. Meanwhile, Marcus Gray hailed from Houston, Texas, where he worked as a locksmith and ran his own small business. Again, he was unmarried and childless. I suppose the three of us did share some characteristics, We were all single introverts around the same age. All of us were suspicious of other people to the extent we could be described as misanthropes. Likewise, we all had comfortable livelihoods but felt unfulfilled. But it was more than that. Olivia, Marcus, and I believed there was something missing from our lives, some dark secret that had been kept from us. We all desired to learn this secret, and this was surely why the antiquarian sought us out, because he had the answers we thought we so desperately needed. As the three of us communicated through private messages, it soon became apparent that Olivia and Marcus had more information than I did. The antiquarian had left me hanging, hinting at the identity of my father and my ultimate destiny. But on the other hand, secrets were revealed to my companions that changed their lives forever. I've made the decision to share their stories here, if only because their fates are linked to my own. I will share their own words, which I received from direct messages, up until the point they broke off contact. Marcus's tale, I don't know what to tell you guys about my upbringing. My family wasn't wealthy, but I was raised right. I didn't know much about my heritage. Mom and Dad were always secretive on that subject. I knew that my great-great-grandfather had changed his surname as a young man, but never knew why, and no one would ever talk about it. I reckoned there was likely a dark family secret which had been kept from me. This wasn't something I dwelt on, however. I was a difficult kid, that would be fair to say. I remember being angry much of the time, but never truly understood why. I would frequently get into fights at school and was in no end of trouble. My parents were very concerned about my behavior. It was almost like they were afraid of me. I guess I always felt this rage inside of me. I got better at controlling it as I grew older, but my inner thoughts were often consumed by violent fantasies. These feelings worried me and contributed to my anxiety, but I never talked about them or sought professional help. In fact, this is the first time I've shared any of this. Anyway, my adult life hasn't been anything special. I've survived, but never been happy. I just existed and played the game. I don't know why I started working as a locksmith. I'm not a people person, and I secretly hate most of my customers. But the idea of being able to access their homes excited me on some deep level. I was able to intrude upon their private domains, and so held a secret power over them. You're probably seeing a lot of red flags here, and you'd be right to do so. But still, I'd repressed these dark impulses, and might well have continued to do so if it hadn't been for the antiquarian's visit. You guys know the score, so I won't repeat it here. When that freak came knocking on my door and started talking about rare books, I was just about ready to tell him to go to hell, but I held my tongue and let him inside my home. I can't explain why, but you guys have been through the same experience, so I know you'll understand. Somehow I felt like I could trust this stranger, and I needed to hear what he had to say. The next bit you know too. He took that damn book out of his satchel and started reading. There were a couple of weird stories he started off on. I remember some talk of a hidden gallery of future apocalypse and a phantom train full of ghosts and ghouls. I don't recall all the details, but these stories scared the hell out of me. But he soon moved on to my own sordid family history. It all goes back to my great-great-grandfather, you see. His name was Ivan Grayson, and he was notorious around these parts between 1922 and 1930. Ivan carried out at least 11 brutal murders in the tri-state area. 11 is what he confessed to anyway, although the true number may have been much higher. Ivan was one of the earliest known serial killers in the Southwest, practicing his ghastly trade with a hunting knife, cutting his victims' throats from ear to ear in savage, but meticulously executed attacks. His trademark was to break into the victims' homes while they were out and lie in wait, launching his murderous assaults once they returned home. And guess what? Ivan trained as a locksmith, just like I did. This was how he gained access to the victims' homes, and he used his profession as a cover for traveling from town to town, scoping out his targets while he planned his murders. It's difficult for me to describe my emotions as I listened to these revelations. Shock, of course, and more than a little fear. But the most extraordinary part was how the antiquarian told the story. He wasn't just reading the words from the book. Well, he was, but it was more than that. When the antiquarian described the murders to me, he didn't just cover every vivid and gory detail. The words he spoke seemed to hold some kind of dark power. Somehow I was transported to the murder scenes, feeling the knife in my hand and the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I was in my ancestor's body, hiding in a stranger's home and waiting for them to return. I vividly recall the terror in their eyes as I revealed myself, charging them with my blade in hand. Some fought back fiercely, meaning I had to stab them multiple times before they fell. Others cowered and begged for mercy. It made no difference in the end, because I slaughtered every victim without a second thought. In truth, I enjoyed reliving my ancestors' heinous crimes, from the screams of his victims to the smell of their blood. It was like a part of me which had been buried deep inside was finally released, and now I knew who I was. But the bloody string of murders came to an inevitable end when the police caught up with my great-great-grandfather during the early years of the Great Depression. The detective who caught him was called Whitmore, a rising star in the local police force who later joined the FBI. As the antiquarian described the arrest, I was once again taken back, possessing my late relative's body as I was thrust into a tight, windowless interrogation room during the hot summer of 1930. Whitmore was standing over me, his face red with fury and his shirt covered in sweat as he screamed in my face. I remember being terrified by his overbearing and intimidating presence. It wasn't just that Whitmore was physically imposing. There was also a malice in his eyes which was truly chilling. I didn't need to imagine what my great-great-grandfather was feeling at that moment. I knew he was scared. It's a crazy thing to imagine a serial killer being afraid of a mere cop. But there was a darkness within Whitmore that was frightening. When my great-great-grandfather didn't confess, Detective Whitmore beat him without mercy. The torture went on for hours, and I felt every blow my ancestor suffered. In the end, he was forced to sign a confession for the 11 murders. I experienced great anger once I learned how my ancestor was subjected to this treatment, even though I realized he was in fact guilty. Ivan Grayson was executed on the 15th of September, 1932. The antiquarian described the execution to me in great detail, and once again I was transported back in time, finding myself strapped to a gurney, shaking uncontrollably as they read me my last rites and administered the lethal injection. The chemicals flowed through me, causing me excruciating pain as my body shut down from the inside out. And then it all went dark, and I was thrust back to the present, sitting on my couch as the antiquarian finished reading before he put the book carefully back in his satchel and made to leave. I tried to stop him. Of course I did. There were still so many unanswered questions in my head. But you know how that goes. The old man doesn't look like much, but he packs a mean punch. And then he left me, having turned my life upside down in the course of one afternoon. I couldn't go back to the way things were, not after everything I'd learned. So I started doing my own research, much like the two of you. As you can imagine, there's been a lot written about my late ancestor. I also came onto these paranormal forums and started asking questions about this antiquarian guy. That's how I got in touch with you guys, obviously. I appreciate having you both to talk to about this crazy stuff. I haven't spoken with my parents. Frankly, I feel betrayed by them both because they hid the truth from me for so long. It's difficult to describe my emotions at this time, but what I feel more than anything else is rage. That anger and lust for violence is no longer buried deep in my psyche. Now it's at the forefront of my consciousness, and the rage has consumed me. My greatest desire is to seek vengeance on behalf of my ancestor Ivan, and I believe it's my duty to continue his legacy. The focus of my hatred has a name, and it's Whitmore. The cop who caught my great-great-grandfather is long dead, of course, but his descendants still live in this area. In fact, his great-grandson is an attorney right here in my town. I know where he lives, and I can get inside. The fire burning within me cannot be diminished. I will have my revenge. As you can imagine, both Olivia and I were left shocked and deeply disturbed by Marcus's final sign-off. If we took his words at face value, we'd have to assume that Marcus would commit a murder in the near future. So, what did we do with this information? I suppose the correct course of action would have been to contact the police, and yet we didn't do so. When we discussed his post, we decided the murder threat was likely a hoax or that he wouldn't go through with it. Deep down, though, I think we both knew this was a lie. I can't speak for Olivia, but I didn't report the murder plot because I wanted to see what would happen. I never did hear from Marcus again, but I was able to piece together the rest of the story through court documents and news reports. On the 23rd of March of this year, a 32-year-old locksmith named Marcus Gray illegally gained access to a private residence in Dallas. In his subsequent confession to detectives, Mr. Gray admitted to breaking into the home with the intention of ambushing and murdering the owner, the well-known defense attorney, Caleb Whitmore. The accused believed the home would be empty at the time, but was confronted by Mr. Whitmore's housekeeper, 25-year-old Isabella Martinez. A struggle ensued which ended in a brutal murder, as Gray stabbed his victim 13 times in a frenzied attack, killing her in the master bedroom. The accused expressed remorse over the murder of Miss Martinez, but decided to follow through on his original plan, moving the housekeeper's corpse to the bathroom before waiting for his target to come home. The detectives investigating the case have praised the bravery of Mr. Whitmore, who was able to overpower, disarm, and subdue the suspect until the police arrived. Mr. Gray has been charged with murder and attempted murder and has been denied bail. It is noted that he is a distant relative of Ivan Grayson, the infamous serial killer who committed 11 murders across 3 states during the 1920s and was executed by lethal injection in 1932. This was the news report from the time, and I don't mind telling you that the account shocked me to my very core. Marcus had played out his violent fantasies and carried out his great-great-grandfather's bloody legacy. But he badly botched his murder plot, slaughtering an innocent woman before getting himself caught. Marcus might have been executed like his ancestor, but he never made it to trial. The last report I read confirmed that Marcus Gray was found dead in his cell on the morning of April 14th. The authorities claimed he'd taken his own life, but I'm not so sure. In any event, one of my contacts was dead, and I still didn't have the answers I needed. I suppose I should have felt disgusted over the whole affair, but in truth, I was frustrated to have hit another brick wall. Now my only hope was Lluvia, and she was able to bring another piece to the puzzle. So I'll tell you her story in her own words. Lluvia tale, there's not much to say about me. Sure, I could recount my childhood in minute detail, but what would be the point of that? I will say that my parents divorced when I was still young. During my adolescence, I turned my back on my father's faith. We fell out over this disagreement and haven't spoken in years. The truth is, I never had much time for religion. During my student days, I was a committed atheist, filled with youthful arrogance and anger against the establishment. In later life, I became much more conformist, although I never considered myself a spiritual person. I suppose I had a decent relationship with my mom. We saw each other regularly, and I continued to visit my mother until her sudden passing from a stroke. I grieved the loss, but in all honesty, we were never that close. I had one serious boyfriend after university. We lived together for about 5 years, but gradually grew apart. I remember the day he broke up with me, saying that I'd become cold and distant. I didn't argue and let him go. A big part of me was relieved. I used to be bothered by things like this. It concerned me that I couldn't maintain a relationship and had no close friends. I reckoned there must be something wrong with me and did seek professional help in my late 20s, but multiple psychiatrists couldn't provide the answers I needed. In the absence of meaningful human interaction, I threw myself into my career. I was always good with numbers, and so pursued this line of work, taking a job as a data analyst after college and working my way up the corporate ladder. I worked long hours and made good money. By any measure, my career has been a great success. But guess what, guys? I was still not satisfied. You both know the feeling all too well. The feeling like a stranger in your own life. A zombie merely going through the motions and pretending to be a human being. And then the antiquarian came to my door. My introduction to this mysterious stranger was much the same as yours. I was highly suspicious, but I led him into my home. I guess I was still apprehensive up to the point he took the book out of his satchel and started to read. From that point onwards, I was transfixed and hanging on his every word. He told me several tales of the unexplained and paranormal, speaking of a red telephone booth that can communicate with the afterlife, a cursed model village which consumed its creator, and a parallel universe which has become the resting place for countless lost ships and planes. I normally don't go in for such fantastical stories and conspiracies. Throughout my life, I've considered myself an educated and logical woman who had no time for the superstitions of the past. And yet the antiquarian's powerful words struck a chord with me, and I felt like he'd reached something deep inside of me, awakening emotions I'd long since buried. And this was before he revealed my true identity. My connection to the past wasn't as direct as it was for Marcus. The dark tragedy in my family's history did not occur within living memory. Instead, the antiquarian took me back to the late 17th century, where a long-forgotten ancestor on my mother's side suffered a grave injustice. My ancestor's name was Margaret Clayworth. She was a minister's wife and a young mother of two. Margaret lived in Salem, Massachusetts during the 1690s, and her short life was not a happy one. Her husband was a Puritan, a real fire and brimstone type who didn't believe in sparing the rod when it came to disciplining his children or his wife, for that matter. The way the antiquarian vividly described the violence and abuse was like nothing I've ever experienced before. I can relate to Marcus's account because I felt the immense power of the antiquarian's words as he read from the ledger. And somehow I was transported back in time, experiencing my ancestors' torments as if they were happening to me. I'll never forget the terror of being in that isolated rural cottage, facing the cold nights under candlelight as I fought to protect the young children's son and daughter from the uncontrollable rage of the minister. It was particularly chilling to realize there was nobody I could call, no one I could turn to for help. I was on my own against this monster. But my ancestor Margaret was not entirely helpless. She had powers. You see, the type of powers I would have previously dismissed as nonsense. But now I know that magic is very real. Margaret was able to do extraordinary things. Communicate with animals, read people's thoughts, and make objects move without touching them. She used her powers in small ways, but was careful to hide her actions from her husband and the wider community, knowing all too well the serious consequences if she was caught. But the minister knew something was amiss, and this only added to his fury. One night he came home in a blind rage, ranting about the devil's influence and the unholy corruption of his family. He charged up the stairs, his face red as he grasped hold of his wooden cane. Margaret confronted her husband at the top of the staircase, but was violently shoved out of the way as her husband made for the children's bedroom. I was in my ancestor's body in that moment, experiencing her acute pain, fear, and anger. I channeled those emotions, using my powers in an act of violent retribution. Without moving from the floor, I unleashed a surge of energy, a righteous, invisible force which threw the minister back down the stairs. This was Margaret's action, but we were one in that moment. I was in control, and I felt such power. I enjoyed seeing the shock and terror in the minister's eyes as he tumbled down the stairs, savoring every crack and cry of pain before he hit the bottom, his neck breaking as he collided with the hard floor. I looked down at his dead eyes and felt no remorse, only a grim satisfaction that the monster's life was ended. But then I turned my head and saw Margaret's young children standing in the doorway, their teary, shock-filled eyes looking upon the violent scene in disbelief. The antiquarian dispassionately continued his reading and confirmed Margaret Clayworth's fate. On the 12th of September, 1695, my ancestor was sentenced to death in Salem Crown Court after being convicted of murder and witchcraft. She was to be burned at the stake. Given what I now knew about Margaret's life and all she'd suffered, I was naturally outraged at the sentence passed down against her. But there was more. Through the antiquarian's words, I was once again transported back in time to the day of the trial. There I was in Margaret's body, terrified as a baying mob called out for my blood. The magistrate restored some degree of order by loudly banging his gavel. But he soon launched into a furious tirade in which he described Margaret as a murderous witch in the service of Satan, before he gleefully sentenced her to burn. I remember the pure hatred and malice in the magistrate's dark eyes as he looked upon me with utter contempt. His hateful glare chilled me to my bones and made me question who was really in league with the devil. But the final memory was, of course, the worst. As I was pulled back to the night of Margaret's execution, once again I possessed my ancestor's physical form as I was tightly tied to the post with a pile of firewood below me. My whole body shook as I fought against my binds and cried out for mercy, but I would get none from the hateful mob of Puritans assembled before the pyre. Their eyes were full of self-righteous anger as they wielded pitchforks and torches and called me every vile name under the sun. A minister spoke some words before the horror began. I can't recall the exact text, but I believe he finished on the phrase, "May God have mercy on your soul," or words to that effect. And then 3 men stepped forward and set the pyre alight. I cried out louder this time, my body sweating and eyes bulging as I watched the flames quickly spread. I felt the heat of the fire starting with the burning of my toes and feet, but soon growing more intense as the flames shot up the stake and engulfed me, melting my skin and flesh in a horrifying inferno. I know that this atrocity happened to my ancestor and not me, but in that memory I could feel her agony, and it was the most intense pain I've ever suffered. Before I blacked out, I saw the magistrate in the crowd watching Margaret's fiery death. A twisted smile etched across his face as he took a perverse pleasure from her suffering. This was when the antiquarian brought me back to the present day. And as you probably guessed, he left my home without elaborating on why he told me this gruesome and tragic tale. There was one more detail he revealed before leaving me. I thought it was irrelevant at the time, and its significance only became apparent after I heard Marcus's story. Because you see, the magistrate who sentenced Margaret Clayworth was called Whitmore. As you can imagine, this revelation has caused me many sleepless nights. I'll confess to having a similar experience to Marcus, as I became obsessed with the words and visions the antiquarian had shared with me to the point where every other part of my life was neglected. I took a leave of absence from my job and spent every waking hour pursuing the mystery. I can find no direct connection between Caleb Whitmore in Dallas and the Massachusetts magistrate who burnt my ancestor at the stake. I have been able to trace the lineage of Magistrate Whitmore, however. His aristocratic family is a prominent one in American society, and one of his descendants is now a federal judge. I know this sounds crazy, particularly after what happened to Marcus, but I too have become obsessed with the desire for revenge against Whitmore. I've tried to tell myself that it's madness and I need to let it go, but I can't do this. I also realize the risks are great, but I am not powerless. I see now that my ancestors' blood runs through my veins, and I inherited her great power. I've been practicing over the last number of weeks and have honed my natural-born skills, learning the ways of my ancestors as I plot my revenge. I can do this. I need to do this for Margaret. That was the last communication I received from Lluvia, and sadly, you can probably guess what happened next. I didn't need to go searching for news this time because the story received national coverage. On the 15th of May, U.S. Federal Judge Thomas Whitmore was attacked, and seriously wounded during a public appearance outside a courthouse in Chicago. The assailant had been identified as 31-year-old Olivia Baker, a data analyst from the city with no previous criminal convictions. Witnesses say Miss Baker approached the judge as he was greeting press and members of the public. She was somehow able to slip past Whitmore's security team and stab him with a knife concealed under her sleeve. Mr. Whitmore was wounded, but not incapacitated, managing to fight off his attacker and throw her down to the pavement. Miss Baker then picked up her weapon and launched a second attack despite warnings from police officers on the scene. She was subsequently shot by a plainclothes detective. Officers attempted to perform CPR on the assailant, but she died on the scene. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitmore was rushed to the hospital, where doctors performed surgery on a deep stab wound in his right shoulder. A government spokesman has since confirmed that the judge's injuries are not life-threatening, and he is expected to make a full recovery. The FBI has stated that Miss Baker has no history of violence and no known links to any extremist or terrorist groups. Investigating officers are currently looking for a motive. I deleted all my messages from Olivia after reading about her botched attack. By this point, I was in a state of disbelief. The antiquarian had provided me with 2 names, and now both were dead, both having attempted to murder men called Whitmore. The name did resonate with me, but as hard as I racked my brains, I couldn't remember where or when I'd first heard it. I threw myself into frantic research and did find many important public and private individuals called Whitmore men and women in politics, the media, finance, and so forth. These Whitmores were seemingly unconnected and spread throughout the English-speaking world. There were many other variations of that surname in various different languages as well. Still, there was no common thread that I could identify. It's no exaggeration to say that I was driven to the edge of insanity by this seemingly unsolvable mystery. I could not sleep at night because every time I closed my eyes, I saw the antiquarian's grinning face, Marcus hanging in his jail cell, and Olivia bleeding to death on the street. I just couldn't understand why all this was happening and what it had to do with me. It was during one of those sleepless nights when the antiquarian returned. I was lying fully clothed on my bed, staring up at the dark ceiling, exhausted but unable to sleep. The clock had just turned to 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's when I heard a familiar loud knocking on my front door. I instantly shot up on my mattress, while my senses heightened as a surge of adrenaline shot through my veins. I practically ran to the front door, sparing no thought for my personal safety as I opened it, and came face to face with the shadowy figure standing on my doorstep. His face was illuminated by my porch light, but even so, it took a moment for me to recognize him. It was the antiquarian, of course, the apparently paranormal entity who went by the name of Dr. Ashford. But he looked different from the last time I'd seen him. Gone was the spark in his eyes, and his wide grin had disappeared. Instead, the poor man looked as if he'd been dragged to hell and back, and was practically on the brink of death. I stood in the doorway, my jaw dropping in shock as I found myself lost for words. In the end, it was the antiquarian who broke the silence, speaking to me in a deep and raspy voice. "Good evening, sir. I apologize for the late hour of my visit. May I come in?" I paused for only a second before replying enthusiastically, "Yes, of course." I made way for the elderly visitor, watching with some degree of sympathy as he struggled down the corridor while relying on his walking cane to keep him steady. It seemed that his physical condition had deteriorated in the months since his last visit, but my primary interest was the familiar satchel he carried in his left hand, because I knew what it contained, the knowledge I desired most in the world. I followed him into my living room, turning the lights on as I impatiently watched the antiquarian struggle over to his seat. I was frustrated that he didn't open his case and pull out the ledger. Instead, he simply stared at me with bloodshot eyes. There was another tense pause before he spoke, and I sensed a sadness in his words when he did so. "So you tracked down Marcus and Lluvia." "I did, and you know what happened to them." "I do, so there is a question you want to ask me." "There is. Who is Whitmore?" The antiquarian appeared deep in thought for a moment, breaking eye contact as he slowly nodded his head. "Whitmore, yes. My employer has used this name for some time." He trailed off without offering a further explanation, but I exploded in angry frustration. There are dozens of Whitmores. The name comes up again and again throughout history, but there's no connection. "No connection you can find," he replied calmly. "You think of these Whitmores as individuals, but in actual fact, they are all vessels of my employer. All are one and the same, be it the magistrate, the detective, the attorney, the federal judge, and of course, your father." Those last two words hit me like a ton of bricks. I was shocked, of course, but also filled with an excitement I can hardly describe as the truth was finally revealed to me. "My father, how is this possible?" "Oh, it's possible," the antiquarian answered solemnly. I noticed how he took little to no pleasure in revealing this information to me. In fact, he almost seemed guilty as he struggled to meet my gaze. "Your mother, no doubt, had her reasons for keeping the truth from you, but my employer's blood runs through your veins. Your heritage brings great power with it, but also considerable expectations." "What do you mean?" I demanded. I was quickly growing tired of the antiquarian's cryptic answers. I noted how his tone darkened before he continued. "My employer has worked tirelessly throughout the centuries to shape the history of humanity. During this time, he has attempted to recruit many mortals to his cause, but the results have been disappointing. Take Mr. Gray and Miss Baker as two examples. We had high hopes for both, but alas, they both came up wanting." "What does that mean?" "Your friends were tested, and they failed. My employer expects you to do much better. You are his flesh and blood, after all." "What does he want me to do?" The antiquarian shot me a half grin, and for a moment I thought I could see some spark come back into his sunken eyes. He didn't answer my question, not directly anyway. Instead, he changed the subject and asked a question of his own. "You look unwell, sir. Have you been sleeping?" I was baffled and irritated, struggling to find the words to reply. "No, of course I haven't." He said thoughtfully as he carefully reached into his satchel. I yearned to see the ledger emerge, but instead he surprised me by pulling out what looked like a business card. I looked on in confusion as the antiquarian sat up from his chair and struggled across the room towards me with the card in hand. "You really should see a doctor, sir. You can't take your health for granted, not when there's so much important work ahead of us." With that, he carefully placed the business card on the coffee table in front of me before heading towards the door. I looked over at him and was tempted to shout out, but instead I glanced down at the card on my table, and then I understood. Because the text read, Dr. Mark Whitmore, MD, family physician, open to new patients. I heard my front door slam shut as the antiquarian walked out into the night. But now it no longer mattered. I knew what had to be done, and it was up to me to prepare for the grisly task to come. I didn't waste any time in planning my next move. After obtaining all the information I could on my target, I destroyed my electronic devices, donned gloves, a scarf, and a baseball cap, and armed myself with a .38 revolver and stiletto dagger. Because you see, it wasn't my intention to confront this Dr. Whitmore and demand answers. My plan was to kill him. People hearing this confession might be confused by the sudden and drastic escalation in my actions. After all, I am a man with no previous criminal history or inclination towards violence. I had no reason to hate Dr. Mark Whitmore or wish him harm. The antiquarian had informed me that a man called Whitmore was my father, and I believed him. But this Dr. Whitmore was the same age as me, and so couldn't possibly be my parent. None of that mattered, however. It seemed all those Whitmores were one and the same vessels for a greater, unseen power. All the pieces were in front of me now. I finally understood what was required of me. Marcus and Lluvia had both failed in their missions. They'd both come from a place of anger, seeking vengeance against those who'd wronged their ancestors. But I was going into this with a clear head, and I felt no moral qualms about ending the vessel's existence. I would kill him and fulfill my destiny. I arrived at the address on the card, which was located off a busy commercial street, and I slowly walked along the pavement with my head down, and a cap covering my face as I tried to avoid attention and conceal my identity from any CCTV cameras. My weapons were hidden in my jacket pockets. The gun was my primary and the dagger my backup, but I wouldn't draw my revolver until the last possible moment. I arrived at the front entrance of the clinic, pausing as I read the nameplate printed on the glass door and confirmed I had the right address. I'd purposely arrived at lunchtime when the clinic would be closed and nearly empty. I therefore expected the door to be locked, and so was surprised to find it left open. It all seemed a little too easy, and I'll admit to feeling a pang of apprehension in that moment. But this soon passed as I carefully pushed open the door with my gloved hand. I entered the reception area and found it abandoned. Even the front desk was unattended, as presumably the receptionist was out for lunch. So far, so good, I thought. Next, I walked behind the reception and soon found Dr. Whitmore's office, discovering the door wide open. I hesitated for a time as I cast my eyes upon my target, watching him as he typed on his keyboard and remained engrossed in his work. Whitmore was a handsome man, neat and well turned out, but surprisingly unremarkable. There was nothing to mark him out as a paranormal entity, or indeed anything other than a dedicated family physician. I had serious doubts in that moment, fearing I had made a terrible mistake, and I stood frozen with indecision in the doorway, my hand on the butt of my gun as I desperately tried to decide what to do next. It didn't take long for the doctor to notice me. He must have sensed my presence or spotted the shadow I cast, because he called out to me without looking up from his computer screen. "I'm afraid the clinic is closed. Please come back later." I didn't answer, instead slowly removing the gun from my jacket pocket. He tutted in annoyance, turning his head away from his monitor. But once he saw me, Dr. Whitmore's eyes lit up with recognition, even though I'd never met him before. "Ah, it's you," he exclaimed amicably. "I was wondering when you'd turn up." He frowned when he saw the gun in my shaking hand. "So that's how you plan to do it?" he asked, more with curiosity than concern. "Well, sir, let's get on with it then." With that, he surprised me by leaping up from his chair and physically jumping on top of his desk. He crouched on all fours, his eyes filled with a predatory zeal as he hissed like an angry cat, and showed me his concerningly sharp teeth. I was frozen in shock, reacting too slowly as I raised my gun and aimed. A split second later, the doctor-turned monster launched himself off the desk and leaped towards me with his eyes wide and fangs exposed. I screamed in terror, firing a single shot which missed the target, and then hit me like a freight train a second later, pushing me out of the room and pinning my body to the carpet, while the gun was simultaneously knocked out of my hand. He was on top of me now, saliva dripping from his fang-filled maw as he held me down firmly. "Come on, my boy, is that all you can muster?" he snarled in cruel mockery. With that, he wrapped his hands around my throat and started to squeeze. I couldn't breathe as he slowly strangled me. I gasped for air as my eyes bulged. I must have been blacking out, but I was determined not to die like this. Digging deep into my reserves, I reached into my pocket and withdrew the dagger, thrusting it deep into my attacker's thigh. He cried out in pain and loosened his grip upon my throat. This gave me an opportunity. I kicked out with all my strength, forcing Whitmore off me. He staggered as blood poured from the wound in his leg, but Whitmore was far from beaten. I went for him again with the dagger, but he easily dodged the attack, punching me hard in the nose and throwing me back into the office. I pulled myself up from the floor and turned just as Whitmore launched a new attack. I held out the knife, but he grabbed my wrist and twisted, forcing me to drop the blade. I barely had time to recover before he hit me again and shoved me back down to the ground. Stunned and terrified, I watched as Whitmore calmly walked over to where the knife had fallen, stooping over and picking it up. "Very disappointing. I expected so much more from you, my son." That certainly had struck a nerve, and I knew it was now or never. I scanned the floor, catching sight of my silver revolver only inches from where I lay. Whitmore was now advancing on me, knife in hand, as he prepared to finish the job. I dived across the floor, grabbing hold of the gun and rolling over before I lifted the weapon and aimed. Whitmore was right on top of me, but this time I had the drop on him. I squeezed the trigger, firing 1, 2, and then 3 shots. Whitmore was struck 3 times in the chest. He barely reacted at first, looking down in surprise at the blood leaking from the bullet wounds and seeping through his previously white shirt. He looked at me in his last moment, managing a half-smile as he said, "Well played, sir." And with that, he dropped heavily to the floor and didn't get back up again. I continued to hold the smoking gun in my shaking hand, hardly believing what I'd just done. And suddenly, I became aware of a new figure standing in the doorway. I spun around and aimed, but held my fire once I recognized a familiar face. It was the antiquarian, his trusty satchel in hand and his sunken eyes emotionless, as he looked over the dead Dr. Whitmore before turning his attention towards me. "Congratulations, sir. You have succeeded where so many others have failed. Now, I believe it's high time you met my employer." I was still trying to work out what he meant when I suddenly became lightheaded, my eyes slowly closing as the darkness took me. I awoke in a strange and frightening place, experiencing a stifling heat as I pulled myself up from a rocky surface and adjusted my eyes to my new surroundings. Inexplicably, I had been transported to a dark and foreign realm, finding myself inside what looked like a great hall carved from rock and dimly illuminated by burning torches. I slowly and cautiously walked upon my shaking legs, scanning the hall in fearful awe while noting the high ceiling above me. The light from the wall-mounted torches allowed me to see the guards lined up on either side of a long walkway which cut down the middle of the hall. These soldiers looked like men, although I suspected they weren't of the mortal realm. They all wore bronze armor and helmets like those of a Roman centurion, and each was armed with a long spear and round shield. The guards stood in tight formation, not moving a muscle as I sheepishly walked past them, although I noticed how their dark, menacing eyes closely followed my progress. I continued walking towards the front of the hall, which was dominated by a great throne of cold iron, and upon it sat a giant wearing black robes, bald-headed, but with a crown of thorns placed atop its huge skull. Again, he took the appearance of a man, but must have been at least 8 feet tall, and was well built to boot, with his bulging muscles visible underneath his robes. He was eating when I approached him, greedily devouring a large slab of red meat on the bone, the blood pouring down his chin while he washed his meal down, taking large gulps from a substantial golden tankard filled with God knows what. He finished eating and thoughtlessly tossed a bone to the ground. I watched as a ragged man in chains scurried across the floor and scooped up the discarded bone, while a second figure, a woman, refilled the giant's tankard without comment. Both appeared to have the status of slaves in this hellish realm, and they soon meekly disappeared into the shadows. A fourth figure was also present, a small man who cowered behind the throne and would not meet my eye. It was only when I got closer that I recognized this meek individual. It was the antiquarian, his head bowed as he maintained a tight grip on his book of red leather, the fabled ledger which was the source of his power and knowledge. But the antiquarian was obviously submissive to the giant who sat upon the throne, and so I forced my attention upon him. The giant saw me approach, his cold eyes of icy blue lighting up in anticipation as he formed his bloody lips into a cruel smile. There he is. Here is the man of the hour, my own flesh and blood, come to claim his rightful place by my side, my son. I stood at the foot of the mighty throne, looking up in awe as I struggled to find the words to respond. Who or what are you? I sputtered nervously. Come now, you are an intelligent young man, and so surely can guess my identity. In truth, I go by many names, both in this realm and the world above. I am king here, but you may call me father. The last word hung in the air, and the chilling implications made me feel sick to the stomach. What had I got myself into? Was this the destiny I had sought for so long? What do you want from me? The demon's sadistic grin widened before he replied. I want you to be the man you were born to be. You have passed your first test, but there is much work to be done. Bring me the book. He clicked his fingers, and the antiquarian sheepishly walked up to the throne, reluctantly handing over his precious ledger, which his master snatched up in his huge hand. He aggressively flicked through the pages while his servant slipped back into the shadows. And then the demon who claimed to be my father started to read, and his spoken words transported me to another place and time as I witnessed visions of my future. Firstly, I found myself standing on a podium decorated with banners and flags, giving a victory speech to a fanatical crowd of cheering supporters. My supporters, a cult dedicated to serve me. Next came a vast military procession down a wide street, which I observed from a balcony high above. Thousands of black-clad troops marched in tight formation, saluting towards me as they goose-stepped upon the asphalt. They were soon followed by tanks and other military hardware, while a squadron of fighter jets flew above our heads. Then came a vision of a prison camp, surrounded by barbed wire fence and guard towers. Inside the cordon were thousands of emaciated, beaten-down prisoners, their eyes filled with fear and hunger as they pleaded for mercy they would surely not receive. It's fair to say that I was extremely disturbed by the images filling my head, but it only got worse as the demon's chilling words brought me to some very dark places. I saw a city engulfed by flames, a mushroom cloud towering over ruins as millions were surely killed in a nuclear inferno. More horrific images of war and suffering followed, and I realized that I was responsible for this future apocalypse. And eventually, I abandoned the devastated Earth, looking down upon the planet's ravaged surface from orbit as I was blasted into the stratosphere. And finally, I stood within a vast domed biosphere, looking out upon a red, lifeless desert. Those living beside me were the most fanatical and loyal supporters. These folks were dedicated to me and my vision, and were here to help me build a new world, while billions were left behind to suffer and die on our doomed home planet. With that, I was returned to the hellish throne room, my body shaking as I looked into the ruthless blue eyes of my demonic so-called father. I was revolted and felt a fiery defiance deep in my belly, finding the courage to stand up to this monster sitting before me. This is horrifying. The demon merely shrugged his shoulders before responding. That depends on your perspective. I consider this as the necessary march of history. It's monstrous, and I will not be part of it. I instantly regretted my outburst, as I expected the demon to react with fury. But instead, he retained his cool composure, his horrific grin barely faltering as he spoke his words through clenched teeth. I think you will, much child. You forget that my blood runs through your veins, and in truth, I know you better than you know yourself. I know the darkness which dwells deep inside of you, the savage cruelty, the lust for absolute power, just waiting to break out. He briefly paused to let that ominous sentence sink in. And there's another reason. The events you've witnessed, the words in this book, and the events of the war to come, this will happen with or without you. And you do not want to disappoint me, my son. Failure comes with a heavy price. He clicked his fingers, and the two figures emerged from the shadows behind him. It was the two slaves who had served his food and drink, the man and the woman. I had barely looked at them before, but now I saw their terrified faces and their mad, bloodshot eyes. There was a sudden spark of recognition in my exhausted brain as I thought back to the photographs on the social media accounts and news reports. The chained slaves were Olivia Baker and Marcus Gray. They had both failed the Demon King and were now condemned to serve him for all eternity, trapped at the whim of his cruel sadism in this hellish realm. And I knew this would be my fate too if I refused him. I was left speechless, looking down at the rocky ground as I couldn't bear to see the suffering of my former companions. Well, now you know the truth, my boy. It's time for you to return to the mortal realm. Think carefully about what I have said, and know that I am always with you." He clicked his fingers once again, and I was consumed by darkness. I lost consciousness, and when I awoke, I was back on the couch in my front room, back where this had all begun. I've had much time to think since my extraordinary experience, but I can't find any logical explanation for what I've been through. The murder of Dr. Whitmore went unsolved. The police and media believed he was killed during an attempted robbery gone wrong. There was no evidence of my involvement in the murder or any links discovered between Olivia, Marcus, and me. It was like everything had been covered up by a hidden power. The only conclusion I can come to is that it's all genuine. It's not just what I've seen and heard. I can feel it deep in my bones. The darkness inside me is all too real, and I can't suppress it any longer. I don't know whether the future I've seen is set in stone. Perhaps the apocalyptic war can be avoided. Maybe I can prevent it if I make different decisions. Or alternatively, the war could well be doomed, and the best I can do is save a select few who can start again. One thing's for certain, however. I have been chosen for this great task, and I've proven my worth in my Father's eyes. The future is mine to shape, and I will not fall short. I'll never tell you my name, but you will come to know me very well in the coming years. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an election to campaign for. I first learned of the hidden portrait of Colonel Ezra Thornfield during my childhood years at our ancestral estate, Thornfield Manor, nestled deep in the remote woodlands of northern Maine. It was my uncle, Professor William Thornfield, my sole guardian after my parents' tragic death in a car accident, who shared this mysterious tale with me. Little was known about our family's colonial ancestor, but supposedly somewhere within the labyrinthine halls of Thornfield Manor existed the private study of Colonel Ezra Thornfield, and within it hung the only known portrait of the man. I never questioned the truth of this story, for I was never permitted to wander the seemingly endless corridors of Thornfield Manor unaccompanied. The risk was too great for a young child to become lost in its twisting, maze-like passages. My uncle was a learned man, a professor of early American history at a small college in Bangor, but also something of a recluse who chose to spend his remaining years at Thornfield Manor after taking on my guardianship. He educated me in subjects like colonial history, folklore, and philosophy, but also hinted at other, more secretive studies he pursued in private. Among the many stories he shared about our family lineage was, of course, the legend of Colonel Ezra's portrait. When I reached the appropriate age, he sent me to the bustling city of Boston, where I first attended a prestigious preparatory school and eventually Harvard University, all funded by our family's considerable inheritance. My initial focus was American history, an interest sparked by my uncle's countless tales. After only a few semesters, however, I shifted to studying contemporary political science, driven by an almost unconscious desire to understand the mechanisms of our modern world. While analyzing the broader workings of society, I became increasingly fascinated with the smaller puzzle of my own family history. As a hobby, really, I set out to construct a complete genealogy of the Thornfield line, something no one had ever attempted, at least according to my uncle's claims. This endeavor, however, seemed doomed from the start. Even after consulting the extensive archives at Harvard's library, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. I could only piece together a fragmentary patchwork of disconnected names and lost relatives. As I learned from my uncle, the Thornfield family had always been insular, and many of its members preferred to retreat from the world, spending their entire lives within the protective walls of Thornfield Manor. Even those who ventured forth, driven by ambition or wanderlust, would invariably return to the estate. The same fate awaited me. Upon graduation, I accepted a position as a research assistant, but my heart never belonged to the bustling metropolis. Instead, I yearned to return to the ancient stones of Thornfield Manor. With each passing year, I felt increasingly out of place in Boston. It was a loud, dirty, and overcrowded city, teeming with people, a place that never slept, an ever-changing beast of mundane social gatherings and excess. The longer I endured its restlessness and wastefulness, the more I longed for the stillness and comfortable melancholy I had felt within the steadfast walls of my home. I felt fundamentally different from other people, like a different species entirely. So, in my late 20s, I decided to leave the great city behind and return home. I had not visited the manor since my uncle had sent me to preparatory school, not even upon his death, honoring his final wish for me to focus on my studies rather than mourn a reclusive old man. Yet I remembered the route perfectly. I knew exactly which small, winding country roads to take, treating the car's GPS as nothing more than whispered confirmation. Eventually, I could make out the towering Gothic spires that formed the heart of Thornfield Manor on the distant horizon. When I laid eyes upon them, the strangest sensation washed over me, a feeling beyond simple nostalgia. It felt almost as if a presence was calling out to me, as if the manor itself was alive and had waited all these years for my return. Thornfield Manor was a monument to architectural madness, and only now did I realize how truly monstrous its proportions were. It was a massive construction that had been continuously expanded over centuries, comprising dozens of buildings, wings, and countless rooms, all interconnected in an amalgamation of generations worth of stone and mortar. Its heart was a magnificent example of Gothic architecture, giving the entire structure a feeling of profound antiquity and making entry into the grand foyer feel like stepping into an ancient cathedral. The wings, added over the centuries, were a showcase of American architectural evolution. The Gothic gave way to the columns and pediments of Georgian colonial style, reminiscent of classical antiquity, before being overtaken by the grander, more elaborate federal style, which was replaced in turn by the ornate Victorian additions. Only the newest sections of the manor were built in more modern and contemporary styles, while many of the manor's distant and forgotten wings were covered in moss and creeping vines. None of the structure's walls showed signs of damage. None of the many remote and half-forgotten sections had collapsed. There was no sign of deterioration or decay throughout the entirety of the manor. How this was possible remained yet another mystery among the seemingly endless number surrounding both it and my family. As I stared at these weathered, century-old walls, at the giant, watchful window eyes, at its almost unsettling patchwork architecture, I was flooded with deep nostalgia. I had longed for this place, and now I knew I was finally and forever home. When I stepped into the building's grand foyer, I felt small, almost like a child again. transported back to my early years when the manor's proportions had seemed unreal and frightening. Its many long hallways were reminiscent of gaping mouths ready to swallow me whole. Even now, it felt as if the manor's interior dimensions, as ridiculous as it sounds, dwarfed even its gigantic exterior. From the grand foyer, a wide hallway stretched onward, leading deeper into the manor, connecting it to its Gothic heart and the various wings and other corridors snaking through the building. As I followed this hallway, my eyes wandered over its elaborate design and numerous lavish decorations. I remembered now that this hallway was not merely an entryway, but something far more significant. My footsteps echoed on the polished marble floor as my hands glided gently over the many tapestries adorning the mighty walls. They depicted iconic scenes from American history, showcased creatures from Native American mythology, and even famous events from the Revolutionary War. Their composition and craftsmanship varied as much as the manor's architecture. Some were centuries old, their fibers stiff and hardened, their colors faded, while others remained in almost pristine condition. Together, they painted a histogram of colors, threads, and stitches of various kinds. The upper portions of the walls were adorned with costly hardwood paneling, coated with gold leaf and other similarly expensive materials. Above it all loomed the hallway's high, intricately carved ceiling, forming a network of the most complex artistry, full of hidden details whose meaning had been lost through the passage of time. Here and there, I found alcoves displaying trophies and artifacts brought back by those members of the Thornfield family line who had ventured out into the world. Venetian masks were propped up next to suits of medieval armor. Statues and figures created by Italian sculptors were accompanied by delicate German wood carvings. Yet there were many other, more exotic items to behold. African stone carvings, tribal masks, clay tablets, Mesopotamian vases, and Asian weaponry. It was a showcase, a testament to the lives lived in Thornfield Manor, to people's occupations and ambitions. This all contributed to the building's general atmosphere. Thornfield Manor was an old place, musty and antique, but most of all, a lonely one. It seemed I was the only person to have set foot within these ancient walls since my uncle's passing. All these decorations, these trophies and artifacts, however, gave it a strange sort of vitality. I had only ever walked through this hallway a few select times, always accompanied by my uncle. Now, for the first time, I was able to truly experience it, to truly absorb it all, and I was utterly overwhelmed. After what felt like hours, and after I had satisfied my curiosity, nostalgia drove me back to my uncle's former living quarters in the manor's eastern wing. It was one of the newer additions to the building, commissioned by my uncle himself upon his return to the manor following my parents' death. My uncle's lodgings were sparsely furnished, an expression of his scholarly, hermit-like lifestyle. No tapestries hung against the walls, no carpets covered the cold marble floor. Instead, there was a stark functionality to everything. Every item had its purpose and was meticulously placed, whether it was his reading chair by the fireplace, the workbenches that hinted at the forgotten art of chemistry, a particular interest of his, or the books in his small but dedicated library. While I could have chosen any other part of the manor, rooms much more lavishly furnished, it was here I felt most at home. It wasn't merely feelings of nostalgia, though, for I too had grown weary of the outside world, of interacting with people, and over the years had developed similar characteristics to those that had so marked my uncle. After I had settled in, I decided to continue my work on the Thornfield family genealogy. During my years in Boston, when this interest was first born, I never found much time to truly pursue it, but here in Thornfield Manor, I felt I had all the time in the world. I planned to record not merely who comprised our family line, but also to document my ancestors' various travels, works, and achievements in all the fields where the Thornfield name had left its mark, however small they might be. I spent days sifting through my uncle's personal library. While I found many old volumes to marvel at, there was scarcely a mention of the Thornfield name in any of them. Only a handful of books written by family members were squeezed between other, more significant works, almost as if placed as an afterthought. One was written by a Margaret Thornfield and comprised roughly 24 melancholic poems authored by the woman herself. Another bore the title On Animal Husbandry, but was nothing more than a lengthy thesis on the breeding of domesticated livestock. The rest were similarly uninteresting and ultimately meaningless in the broader scope of my project. Before long, I ventured forth into the depths of Thornfield Manor, for my uncle had spoken to me of other quarters similar to his, which had been left undisturbed for years. Whenever he mentioned them, it was with a certain reservation. The manor was too large, had become a beast too sprawling to ever fully catalog, and there seemed to be an almost unspoken rule to leave those lodgings as they were, to serve as memorials to their former inhabitants' existence on earth. Many of them, however, had gathered knowledge and books of their own, and my uncle had often visited those small enclaves of learning, and on special occasions even borrowed a book or two. Whenever I set out on those long, solitary walks through the manor's seemingly endless, winding passages, I was filled with an unrelenting melancholy. All these hallways, all these rooms, they were covered in dust and cobwebs, filled with nothing but memories of people long gone, people who had once lived here and were now entirely forgotten. This filled me with what I can only describe as a melancholic loneliness, for these old, gigantic walls that made up Thornfield Manor were filled with an oppressive stillness, an almost suffocating emptiness that you could almost feel pressing against you. I couldn't help but wonder if my uncle and those before him had felt the same thing as they wandered through the manor. From the books I found and consulted during these walks, I slowly learned more about Colonel Ezra Thornfield. The man was born in the middle of the 17th century, supposedly in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He was a man of many talents and even more ventures, an explorer, treasure hunter, and scholar. He amassed a massive fortune over his lifetime and eventually constructed the heart of what would one day become known as Thornfield Manor. The stories of the man's life were numerous and as colorful and varied as the number of books I consulted. Some were diaries written by distant ancestors of mine. Others were books entirely unrelated to the man's life, but mentioned his influence in deeds and footnotes written on yellowed pages and scribbled between the lines. It was said that in his younger years, Colonel Ezra Thornfield became involved in King Philip's War and was a secret advisor to colonial leaders during the final stages of the conflict. However, he later set out on extensive travels, following in the footsteps of such legendary figures as Christopher Columbus and Henry Hudson, participating in vast journeys along trading routes, joining expeditions into the heart of unexplored territories, and supposedly even accompanying early explorers on voyages to the Caribbean and South America. It was these travels that eventually allowed him to gain control of certain sectors of colonial trade and amass vast wealth. How many of these stories were true, and how many were nothing but legends and exaggerations, I wasn't able to determine, but they were enough to paint a rough picture of the man and our family line's origins. In all those books, however, I never found a description, much less a portrait of the man. The only thing mentioned was the same rumor my uncle had shared with me. Somewhere deep within Thornfield Manor lay Colonel Ezra Thornfield's old study, and within it, the sole existing portrait of his likeness. In the weeks to come, I made substantial progress in my endeavor and steadily filled out the Thornfield family tree. What had originally been nothing but a patchwork of a few scattered names finally took shape and form. As the work neared completion, however, I felt increasingly drawn to the secrets of the manor itself, and I began to take exhaustive walks through its endless hallways. What had been nothing but mild curiosity, serving the purpose of learning more about the many members of my family, soon became a sort of meditative obsession. Many times, without knowing why, I found I had left my notes and quarters behind and half in thought had begun yet another excursion through some distant wing. My head filled with thoughts about Colonel Ezra's life and his mysterious study. Before long, these walks grew not only more frequent, but also longer. On certain days, I found myself spending almost all my waking hours wandering and deep in thought. Slowly, ever so slowly, my obsession grew, became a hot, almost burning desire. Wherever I went, however much I walked, I found no hint of the fabled study. Deep inside, I had hoped, half expected, to eventually traverse the manor in its entirety and stumble upon it by accident. But the manor proved much larger than I had ever imagined. With each walk, with each day, I found more hallways, more rooms, found myself in entirely new areas, apartments and wings, places hidden away that I had never known existed. Eventually, out of desperation, I decided to consult the manor's floor plans. It became evident that I wasn't the first who had attempted to make sense of the labyrinthian monstrosity that was Thornfield Manor. An almost innumerable number of floor plans of varying quality and design existed. Some were delicate, the work of educated men, others crude and hand-drawn. Some resembled ever-growing patchworks, as if they were the efforts of multiple people continued throughout generations, the works of fevered insanity. They differed wildly, at times made no sense. At others included hidden rooms and secret wings that didn't exist. It was nothing but purest madness, and yet I was driven by the singular purpose of making sense of it all. Even among those floor plans, however, I soon realized there was no hint of Colonel Ezra's study, and I began to wonder if it truly existed. Yet my obsession never waned. The burning desire never left me, and if anything, seemed to grow ever stronger. Soon it affected me not only during the day, but also at night, for I became haunted by dreams of the strangest sort. In them, I was walking through a grand structure, a hall wider than any I had encountered in the manor. Its ceiling was high and arched, its walls covered in innumerable doorways, giving them the appearance of a crazed honeycomb. Whenever I turned to look through these doorways, I witnessed strange, unholy things. Some led into dark, looming corridors, others into rooms where I saw performances of forbidden rituals, the work of sorcerers and practitioners of magic, of chemistry and other disciplines of the occult. I even saw what I assumed to be chambers of torture, filled with blood and gore, in which creatures not entirely human were born. These twisted creatures roamed the most distant of the dark corridors, beings forever warped and ruined, perpetually broken, and only the echo of their miserable cries was evidence of their existence. Nonetheless, it was a place of wonder, and its results, as ghastly and abominable as they were magnificent and awe-inspiring. The end of these dreams was always the same, however. After traversing the great hall for what felt like an eternity, I found myself before a giant arched entryway. This arch, I knew, led into a single room, a mad construction and amalgamation of all things wrong in this world, a room grander than even this hall. The study of none other than Colonel Ezra Thornfield. Yet I was never able to set foot inside, for the moment I laid eyes upon the structure, I always awoke, shivering and covered in cold sweat. These dreams unsettled me more than anything, for I wondered why my mind conjured up these ghastly visions, and how they came to haunt me every night without fail. Their effect on me was noticeable, for I began to suffer from increased superstition about the old walls and what lay beyond them, what lay hidden in the unexplored depths of Thornfield Manor. With each week, with each day, these feelings seemed to increase and spread over my consciousness like a shroud of purest darkness. Even worse, with each night, the dreams grew more vivid, more detailed, and my knowledge of the abominable hall and its many adjacent rooms and dark corridors grew ever deeper. In one dream, I heard prayers in a language older than any known to humanity, participated in strange divination, and even hours after waking, I shuddered at the outlandish and otherworldly things revealed there. In another, I witnessed the creation of what I came to call flesh constructs. They were meticulously formed from the meat of different animals, combined and brought to life by arcane incantations, or created from human beings, their bodies first torn apart, then fused together in ways too different from what they once were. I even caught glimpses of the secret art of alchemy used to transform base metals into gold, of the cultivation of mandrakes, and concoctions so strange their effects defied my understanding. Sometimes, when I awoke from those dreams, I felt something that differed from the usual terror, for it was replaced by the strangest feeling of familiarity, as if I had walked those halls before. During my waking hours, I had long considered those dreams nothing but twisted interpretations of my long walks through Thornfield Manor, warped and distorted by my innermost fears and worries, a byproduct of my ever-growing obsession. These feelings of familiarity, however, troubled me deeply. Even as the dreams grew worse, I never gave up on my work, continued consulting floor plans, continued traversing Thornfield Manor, and slowly my knowledge of my old ancestral family home expanded. First, only in the most minute ways, but before long, bit by bit, the manor's complicated layouts became clear to me. With this understanding, more and more details of what my uncle had told me returned to me. It felt as if I was leafing through a hidden tome, and with each day, I was able to turn a new page and read yet another paragraph. I remembered my uncle telling me that Colonel Ezra's study wasn't merely a random location within Thornfield Manor, but supposedly its very center, its foundation, and only reachable if one walked in the footsteps of the man himself and made their way to these very first rooms. As I labored away, I realized that while many of the floor plans differed wildly, certain rooms and corridors were always there, always the same. By slowly combining them, stacking all their mad details on top of one another, I knew, somehow I knew, a way through this mad labyrinth would reveal itself, and with it, a path that would lead me to Colonel Ezra's study. It was trial and error, sheer insanity. I only took breaks to eat and rest. I drew endlessly, created my very own floor plans, only to reject them again for an abundance of errors. Eventually, after how many weeks or months I cannot say, I succeeded in what I had set out to do. What I created was a crude, hand-drawn map of my very own, covered in notes and rambling annotations, filling almost the entirety of the floor of my meager quarters. But just as I had thought, as I had known, I had found a singular path that snaked through the manor and reached what I could only assume to be its center. I set out almost immediately, driven half mad and wanting to prove that the study was just that. A room, a study, one that couldn't be more different from the ghastly dreams that so haunted me, and to dispel these strange nocturnal illusions once and for all. As I set out, flashlight in hand, I soon left the well-known hallways behind and instead followed narrow corridors, went up and down staircases, entered hidden rooms, and opened secret doors. It felt like I was traveling back in time, as everything surrounding me grew older the further I progressed. At first, the path led me through rooms of contemporary and modern design, but I soon entered those of an older kind, of neoclassical and Victorian furnishings, before finally ones that reminded me of the interior of colonial-era buildings. All the while, normal lamps and light bulbs were slowly replaced by oil lamps, candles, and even old fireplaces covered in the dust of centuries. After what felt like days, or indeed centuries, traveled back in time, I finally made it to a room that appeared older than even the oldest parts of the manor itself. It was entirely unimpressive, nothing but a small, cramped chamber, but its back wall comprised nothing but a giant and heavily ornate hardwood door. It was covered in a variety of delicate carvings. Creatures of mythology held sway over one side, while the other was decorated with biblical scenes. Yet behind them, I glimpsed creatures much different. Twisted, abominable beings hidden in the background, a mockery of the otherwise grand design, as if something older and darker was lurking behind the all-too-common iconography. When I tried to open the door, I first thought it was securely locked, before I realized just how heavy this age-old barrier truly was. With all the force I could muster, grunting, panting, and cursing, I finally managed to crack it open and was instantly assaulted by stale, moist air thicker than any I had encountered before. It wafted from the doorway as thick as fog, and like pestilent vapors, spread sluggishly over the room's floor. It was air full of the smell of old age, the passage of centuries, but also pregnant with indescribable, otherworldly essence. I pushed myself past the door's heavy wood, ready to set foot into Colonel Ezra's study, and to finally lay eyes on the man's fabled portrait. What I found instead, however, were the first steps of an old spiral staircase that led down into the depths of the earth. For a moment I stared at these stairs and the looming darkness that lay beyond. But then, driven by an almost unnatural sense of curiosity, I began my descent. The stairs were old, ancient even, carved from stone, and covered in thick moss and heavy moisture. As I followed them round and round and round, I began to wonder just how far below the earth they led. Once more, the memory of those terrible dreams assaulted me, but I told myself they were nothing but nonsense, a flight of the imagination. These stairs, all they did was lead me to yet another hidden chamber, a basement study, or something similar to it. Yet they continued on endlessly, and as minutes turned to what felt like hours, my fear slowly returned. I felt like I wasn't merely descending to the hidden depths of Thornfield Manor, but to hell itself. Before long, however, all those fears, all those worries, were pushed aside by a rising feeling of euphoria. This was what I had been looking for. This was what all these fevered months of study had been for, what held the answer I so desperately craved. This obsession of mine, when had it truly started? I thought back to my arrival at Thornfield Manor, to my time in Boston, my education at the preparatory school. And I realized that in one way or another, it had always lurked in the back of my mind, lying dormant and hidden ever since I had heard those tales from my uncle. I had longed to learn about my family line, our ancestral home, and of course, the study of Colonel Ezra Thornfield. This longing was the true reason I had returned home. It wasn't my discontent with modern society, and neither was it nostalgia. Goosebumps appeared all over my arms, and I couldn't help but shudder at this newest revelation. It felt almost as if I had been destined to come here, had always been destined to find this place, and be here at this very moment. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, a dim light reached me from what was without a doubt the bottom of the stairs. Once I descended these final steps, I found yet another hardwood door, but one that was slightly ajar, and from this very crack, the dim light reached me. Stepping up to it, I reached out for the heavy wood, slowly caressing it, making sure it truly existed before I pushed it open. My eyes grew wide when I saw what was revealed in front of me. It was a grand hall, just like the one I had seen in those ghastly dreams. One grander than any I had seen before, whether at Thornfield Manor or even in the great city of Boston. It was a monumental construction, as if carved from the guts of the earth itself. The first thing I noticed was an abundance of light sources of all kinds. I saw modern electrical lights, but also oil lamps and candles, a strange mixture of the modern and the old, as if new kinds of technology had simply been added or layered over what was already there, an amalgamation of things past and present. I began to wonder, however, why there was light down here, who had turned it on and who had lit all those oil lamps and candles. It could only mean that someone else was down here. I shivered. Who might call this ancient, hidden hall their home? My eyes wandered around in search, but I saw no one. The thought of going back, to flee, to forget whatever I had found here, appeared in my mind. This was too strange, but it was almost instantly pushed aside by the same fevered obsession that had so driven me these past months. All thoughts of danger were forgotten, and I set out to find what I had come for, the study of Colonel Ezra Thornfield. With each step, the same feeling of familiarity, of recognition, came over me, one that only grew in intensity. These walls, the floor, the doorways that lined the walls, the corridors they led into. I had seen it all before, but not just in those terrible dreams. I stared at the impossibility in front of me. No, all around me, staring at what I still believed, hoped to be a flight of fancy, a demon of the imagination. If I only waited, it would be replaced by reality and show me where I had really found my way to. However much I waited, though, nothing changed. The grand hall stayed as it was, and I finally had to admit that this place was real, that this place was the same one I had seen in all those ghastly dreams. Yet what actually was this place? Why was it here? I was torn from my thoughts when I noticed movement to my left. A figure, its features hidden under a heavy shroud, had appeared at a doorway to my right and came rushing toward me. I reeled back in terror, raised my arms ready to defend myself from whatever this was. Yet the figure paid me no heed, hurried past me, and entered another doorway, where it vanished in the looming darkness that lay ahead. For a moment, I was too stunned to do anything, and all I was able to do was stare after it, waiting for it to return. Yet the figure was simply gone. Then I began to wonder about something else. If the dreams were indeed true, then what about all those abominable horrors and deeds I had witnessed? Did it mean that those, too, were real? Once more, the impossible situation I found myself in came crashing down on me. And what little remained of the man who had once lived in Boston screamed at me to abandon this crazy need for answers. Yet those were the words of a sane man, and I wasn't truly sane anymore. Hadn't been in weeks, months, maybe even years. It felt like I was barely in control of my body as I set out again and ventured deeper into the hall. My footsteps echoed endlessly on the cold, hard stone floor, their echoes traveling ahead of me and intruding deep into the distant dark corridors all around me. Every once in a while, however, other, more distant sounds reached me. They originated from deep inside those looming dark corridors, sounding like moans and groans. I shuddered when I saw shuffling shadows and couldn't help but imagine them to be the flesh constructs I had witnessed in my dreams. Twisted beings created down here, things made of wet flesh and torn skin, doomed for all eternity and left alone in nothing but their misery, suffering, and pain. Before long, I saw more of the shrouded figures, but they too ignored me and hurried past me, undeterred. Dozens, if not hundreds of them were down here, feverishly working on something in a trance. My eyes trailed after them, and I noticed just how much their forms differed. Some seemed normal enough, their proportions human, their movement bipedal. Others, however, were hunched over, much smaller or taller than me, moving on all fours or slithering over the ground like reptiles, their motions jerky and animalistic. Rooms like the ones I had glimpsed in those ghastly dreams had taken the place of dark, looming corridors. Some seemed to be studies, workstations, and reading quarters, but others were just as horrible as those the dreams had shown me. They were drenched in disgusting liquids, filled with twisted altars and abominable horrors. Yet none of them mattered, for I eventually found what I was looking for: the study of Colonel Ezra Thornfield. Just like in the dreams, I stood before a giant arched entryway, but for the first time I was able to lay eyes upon it, could step through it, and now saw just how huge, how magnificent the study truly was. The words room or study didn't fit this impossibility at all. It was a work of architectural insanity, a design so grand it made my head hurt. It comprised what had to be dozens of open levels, all stacked upon one another, connected by a mad network of bridges and stairs, rising further and further upward, but also down, even deeper into the guts of the earth. Here too, shrouded figures were everywhere, but their numbers were uncountable. They were standing before urns and desks, studying ancient tomes, vellum, papyrus, and even stone tablets, working on complicated machinery and contraptions, or hurrying here and there, carrying items as strange as they were outlandish. All this made it seem like I had intruded on an entire hidden society, a society of the shrouded and shunned. Finally, though, I found what I had been looking for so long. Against the study's back wall, opposite the giant arched entryway, and not hidden behind stairs or bridges, lay the portrait of Colonel Ezra Thornfield, the hidden portrait of my family's fabled progenitor. The portrait's size too defied all reason. It was tremendous, larger than any portrait or work of art I had ever laid eyes upon. A grand display, no, a monument. It was a portrait of a finely dressed elderly gentleman, but one that looked almost too mundane, too ordinary, to be the basis of so many legends and rumors. As I stared at it, however, it slowly began to change. Colors began running into one another, and the man seemed to move as if alive, no, was warping himself. What was human slowly, ever so slowly, became something entirely different. Arms and legs began to atrophy and were replaced by twisted appendages. The neck seemed to extend, and the head was pushed further and further from its body before it opened up like the bulb of a flower, revealing something horrible within. Even the lower body was transforming, changing state from solid to liquid and finally gaseous, only to become solid again, perpetually shifting. The thing I saw in front of me was physically impossible, something that shouldn't exist, couldn't spawn from any earthly imagination. It was a twisted abomination, so alien it made my head hurt. The longer I stared, the more horrible and surreal details I noticed. More parts of a grand whole, parts impossible to fathom. I saw mouths, eyes, hair, appendages, entire bodies fused together but eternally apart, things liquid and gaseous, all forming a creature, an entity not of this world. Yet as I stared at it, I felt drawn forward, felt an almost obsessive need to bask in its presence, to prostrate myself before this ghastly horror, to touch it, to bind my existence to it. I see you arrived after all, Marcus. I suddenly heard a voice from behind me. I jerked up in shock, but wasn't able to tear my eyes from the ever-shifting painting in front of me. Instead, I could only stand there, stare ahead, unable to do anything but listen to the voice from behind me. Yet somehow this voice, it sounded almost familiar. It's remarkable, isn't it? Finally, and with tremendous effort, I was able to open my mouth, able to form words, but could only utter a single question while my eyes were still glued to the impossibility in front of me. What is this? It's what you set out to find, the hidden portrait of Colonel Ezra Thornfield. But this thing, Colonel Ezra Thornfield, was more than a man, much, much more. He was a being from a different realm, a visitor who took on the guise of man and walked our world. Yet his true form was too powerful and could not be constrained. Eventually, he had to retreat, but the being that was Colonel Ezra Thornfield knew there were ways, even if they were difficult, to return in all its glory. And so he created all this here and made plans that would eventually allow him, it to stay in this realm perpetually, to conquer this world and make it his. How? I felt a hand landing on my shoulder, and finally I was able to tear my eyes from the gigantic portrait. As I turned around, I found one of the shrouded figures in front of me. Its entire body was covered by heavy fabric, and even its face was nothing but a shadow hidden by the shroud's folds. Come, I'll show you. Now that my attention was fully focused on the mysterious figure, now that I truly listened, I realized why its voice had sounded so familiar. Uncle William, is that you? But how are you? A sound that might very well have been laughter came from between the folds before the figure began walking. And I, not knowing what else to do and in need of answers, simply followed after it. We traversed the entire width of the study and eventually ascended one of the many stairs, pushing past other feverishly working shrouded figures. My eyes wandered around, trying to take in, to understand what was happening here, but there was too much going on. Madness, I thought, like an anthill taken over by fevered insanity. He created servants. These servants are the ones who will eventually create the right conditions for him to return in all his terrifying glory, without being restricted to the body of man. Before he left, he gave instructions, taught them how to continue the work, and the steps on how to create other similar beings. Those servants are our lineage, the Thornfield family. But what do you mean by created? By now, my uncle had stopped in front of a metal door embedded in the study's wall. Instead of answering or even acknowledging my question, he pushed it open and beckoned me to follow him. What I saw in front of me was a sort of laboratory, but it too seemed to be a mixture of the old and the new. In a distant corner, I saw medieval experimenting tables. Stacks of minerals, mud, and clay covered them, and in front stood shrouded figures, forming them into approximations of the human body. In another area, I saw lumps of raw flesh sewn together into abominable forms, twisted beings resembling neither man nor animal, things comprising nothing but arms or bodies, snake-like and slithering beings created with a singular purpose in mind. At first I thought they were nothing but models, but then I saw them twitch and stir, showing they were alive. My eyes, however, focused on the most modern part of this mad place, something resembling a genetic laboratory. It comprised modern equipment, test tubes, tanks, and vats in which things were growing, things close to the human form. Embryos, I realized. What is this place? What's happening here? Have you ever read Thomas Browne's Religio Medici? What about Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Faust, or Mary Shelley's Frankenstein? I just stared at the figure that had once been my uncle, still not understanding what these books, these names, had to do with the madness I was witnessing here. Have you ever heard the word homunculus? I opened my mouth, but instead of answering, I watched the twisted work that continued all around us, watched as bodies were formed from clay and mud, as lumps of flesh were being stacked on top of one another. And once more I stared at the human-shaped things growing in the vats and tanks. No, it can't be. This makes no sense. Something like this. I stammered, overwhelmed by the revelation that had just hit me. As I explained before, he created servants, beings not entirely human, approximations, fakes, homunculi, if you will. But in time, the process was being improved, perfected even, and what were once crude amalgamations of flesh eventually became indistinguishable from true humans. But why are you showing me all this? Why did you bring me to this godforsaken place? As if to answer, his hand fell on my shoulder, and for a moment he gave me a caressing squeeze. It was all that was necessary to answer my question, to confirm the terrible truth of our lineage. We were created for a single purpose, Marcus. No, how can any of this? How can I? I grew up at Thornfield Manor. You told me about my parents, what happened to them, and you were created in this very room, Marcus, just like I was before you and all those others you see here. Let me ask you, doesn't this place feel familiar? Haven't you seen it before? It's because of the dreams. I saw it in my dreams. They haunted me for weeks, for months. So what exactly are dreams, Marcus? Aren't they nothing but our brains sorting through our memories and interpreting them? Didn't you feel the familiarity of this place the moment you stepped inside it? I couldn't go on. He was right. The familiarity I had felt from those dreams, it was because I had felt like I was retracing my very own steps. But then why send me to Boston? Why encourage me the way you did? Why did you tell me never to return to Thornfield Manor? A sigh of the deepest regret sounded from my uncle's ancient throat before he spoke again. Because I cared for you. I didn't want you to return, didn't want you to become part of all this. I wanted you to be free, to get away. But what I failed to understand is that you're here now, and I guess it was always meant to happen this way. All I tried, all I did, it was all predestined in this very room before you, before I were even formed. Your life, just like mine, and that of any other member of the Thornfield family, was laid out long before. No, that's not true. Sure, you took care of me, and sure, you chose that preparatory school for me. But after that, I decided things on my own. My field of study, And why did you choose those specific fields? Why history? Why political science? Why did you decide to bother trying to understand the workings of the modern world? Once more, I couldn't go on. I began to think, to really think. Hadn't all of this happened because of my upbringing, because of my obsession with all the stories I had heard about my family? Hadn't it been my wish to understand how my family came to be, and thus been driven to also make sense of the world? And yet why? Why exactly? The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had been pushed, goaded in this direction by an invisible power, as if it had been whispered to me by something else, and all I had ever done had been chosen for me. But then why? Why would I even be allowed to go out into the world? Why bother with this entire charade if this is our work, if this is what we're destined to do? Why allow anyone to travel, to explore, and the world is ever changing, Marcus. It's always turning, and there's always new knowledge to be added to our vast archives. Whenever we succeed and are able to create a perfect specimen, those creatures become the members of the Thornfield family and are sent out into the world to gather the knowledge we need before they eventually return to join the rest of us on our eternal mission. Eternal mission. Suddenly, I remembered who I was even talking to. My uncle. How was he even alive? How are you even here, Uncle William? I mean those letters, the death certificate. How can you possibly be? I didn't die, Marcus. It was merely the end of my tutelage and my role as your guardian. None of us ever truly die. What does that even mean? I got a hold of him, and in my frustration, my confusion, I began to shake him. Suddenly, the shroud covering his face was thrown aside. The face I saw was one that shouldn't be alive. It was nothing but taut skin stretched over brittle bone. Where his eyes should have been, eyes that were once a piercing blue, were now only two deep, gaping holes. His nose was nothing but a twisted mess of darkened cartilage. What remained of his lips was curled back, revealing part of the jaw and a few lonely, blackened teeth. I screamed and reeled back in terror, and my uncle, with a trembling hand comprising nothing but bone, quickly covered his features again, as if to hide his wretched appearance from not only me, but the rest of the world as well. That's our lineage, Marcus. It's our curse. We're made to serve, and serve we shall for eternity. We've gotten better at creating these bodies, but they still age, still break, and yet. But how can you even? How is that? There are ways, Marcus, knowledge, and in time we learned many things, and so will you. For a moment I was baffled by his last words, but then I understood what they meant, understood why I had been led here. Terror washed over me, and my entire body began trembling. Oh God, I was meant to become one of those things, those shrouded figures. I was meant to be enslaved down here for all eternity, just like they were, meant to join this ghastly work and bring back this awe-inspiring, magnificent, terrible entity. And just like my uncle and all those countless others, I'd turn into a rotting corpse, another broken thing cursed to serve forever. In a panic, I dashed past the shriveled corpse that had once been my uncle and ran away. He didn't reach out for me. He didn't come after me, and only his words followed me. How futile it is, was all he said. But those 4 words were filled with such endless misery, sadness, and pain, they made me stumble as if struck. As I ran, I pushed myself through the mass of shrouded figures, pushed them aside and into one another, revealing what lay below their heavy shrouds. Many of them were as feeble as Uncle William, comprising nothing but skin and bone, nothing but walking corpses. Others were twisted heaps of flesh that made me reel back in disgust. Amalgamations just like those I had seen being created in that laboratory. Some were even stranger, however. Nothing but clay and stone golems, I realized. I even saw mixtures of the organic and inorganic, constructs of living tissue and various minerals. There were even some my hands passed right through, found nothing to hold on to, gaseous entities comprising nothing but glowing orbs, as if only their souls remained, yet still bound, still conscripted. It was the horror of existence in all its magnificent glory, driven to its sheer, impossible limits, and then beyond. I eventually reached the stairs and continued my dash upward. On and on I went. When my legs failed, I continued to crawl, clawing at the stairs ahead of me. Further and further, I dragged myself, pulling myself onward over moist, moss-covered steps. Before, after what felt like an eternity, I escaped from the staircase. I expected someone or something to come after me, to drag me back down. But I was strangely left to my own devices. Upon returning to my quarters, I set out to end it all, to burn it all to the ground. Thornfield Manor, the legacy of what I had thought to be the Thornfield family line, and to close off that abominable staircase and what lay below forever. And yet I couldn't do it. Countless times I lit the match. Countless times I held the blazing embers in my hand, but did nothing. The few times I managed to set fire to a tapestry or a tome in my uncle's library, I doused them as quickly as they were born. Something's reaching out to me, into my mind, telling me, compelling me, commanding me to stop all this nonsensical struggle and to follow my birthright. I told myself I wouldn't. I screamed at myself to run, to flee from Thornfield Manor. But whenever I tried, I found myself lost in the labyrinthian mess of halls, always returning to where I started. Every day, every night, every single minute, it becomes harder to resist the voices that tell me to return, to serve, and to become part of its eternal mission. I know I can't last. I won't last. That's why I was left alone, why I wasn't bothered upon my return from that terrible place. All I can do is share these mad, incoherent ramblings, this warning that most will discard as the words of a madman. I don't know what this thing is. I don't know how or when, but I know one day the terrible entity that was once known as Colonel Ezra Thornfield will return. And when it does, all will be lost. You ever think about whether you've possibly run across a serial killer without even knowing it? They're not so common these days. Modern stats would have you believe, but I think it still happens, because I believe it happened to me. We were building an addition to Dallas Presbyterian Medical Center, big project, 6 stories with 3 wings connecting to the main building. The frame was about halfway done when this guy started to show up. He just appeared one day in April. Tall, really thin guy wearing a gray hoodie that was way too clean for construction. He always carried this worn leather portfolio, the kind art students use for sketches. He'd walk around the site perimeter, taking notes in a small black sketchbook. One of our guys asked if he was an inspector. I had no clue. Nobody told us about any inspection scheduled. The weird part was he never wore a hard hat, never checked in at the site office either, and he never talked to any of us. Instead, he seemed to just watch. One of the newer guys, Breeden Kozlov, was suspicious too. "That guy doesn't look at the building," he said during lunch one day. "He looks at us." I told Breeden to leave it alone, but the next day I saw him walk up to the guy near the east scaffolding. I was working on the 4th floor, couldn't hear what they said, but I saw Breeden trying to be friendly. The tall man just smiled, not a normal smile at all, then turned and walked away. Later, Breeden told me he didn't say a word, just stared at me like he was memorizing my face. The tall man didn't show up for a couple of days after that. Then Breeden started to miss work, didn't even call in. That wasn't like him. When he missed a 3rd day, we called his emergency contact, which was his roommate. He called back that evening, voice shaking. Breeden was dead. Someone had stabbed him 17 times in his apartment. I was called to Breeden's apartment to identify some of his work stuff. What I saw there still keeps me up at night. The walls were covered with sketches, not professional ones. Hand-drawn pictures of the hospital mixed with floor plans of houses, our houses. My kitchen window was drawn perfectly, even showing the small crack in the corner I hadn't yet fixed. A detective showed me some security footage from the site. The tall man was careful to avoid most cameras, but one caught him looking right at it, with that same empty smile Breeden had mentioned. The detective explained he was a former patient at this same hospital. Had some kind of breakdown after his daughter died during a routine surgery. Blamed the doctors, the hospital, everything. When I asked why he had targeted one of my workers, the detective replied, "You're expanding the place where he lost everything." In his mind, I think you're helping them kill more people. They found detailed plans in Breeden's apartment, showing how the man was going to sabotage critical support beams, so that sections of the building would eventually collapse after opening. I wonder if Breeden had interrupted what he was doing that day, and he wasn't happy about that. There was a massive manhunt for weeks afterward. Construction was halted and eventually started again with police guards. We checked and rechecked everything during the build. Didn't find any tampering, thankfully. Never found the tall man either. Since then, I've heard stories from 4 other construction sites in the Dallas area. Workers talking about seeing a tall guy with a sketch portfolio hanging around at dusk. Last month, a welder from another medical building project didn't show up for work. They found drawings in his truck, not of the building he was working on, but of the next healthcare facility planned for the region. The cops never officially connected these cases. The detective who handled Breeden's murder transferred to Austin, and new officers don't seem too concerned about the sketch artist. But we are. Every construction crew warns each other. If you see him watching, you're already in danger. I've installed security cameras and motion sensors at my house. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear someone outside. The worst part is nobody believes there's a connection, except those of us who have seen him. He leaves no evidence except those detailed drawings and the dead who are found. I keep track of every rumored sighting and every unexplained disappearance in construction around here. There's definitely a pattern, but it's too spread out for the authorities to truly care. 3 weeks ago, my nephew started working construction in Fort Worth. Called me last Tuesday, voice tight with worry. "Uncle David, there's this guy who's been hanging around our site. Tall, thin, carries a portfolio. He just watches us work." My blood ran cold. I told him to quit immediately, find another job, anything. But he laughed it off, said I was being paranoid. Yesterday, his crew chief called. My nephew didn't show up for work. Police found his apartment door wide open, signs of a struggle inside. On his kitchen table was a single sheet of paper. A detailed sketch of the children's hospital they're building in Fort Worth. Every entrance, every emergency exit, every structural support beam carefully marked. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, "For Emma, who should still be here." Emma, that was his daughter's name, the one who died at Dallas Presbyterian. The police are calling it a coincidence. Another missing construction worker probably just ran off with some girl. They don't see the pattern. But I do, and now he's taken my nephew. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what's happening to construction workers in Texas. The sketch artist is real, he's methodical, and he's not done. If you're reading this and you work construction anywhere near a hospital, medical center, or clinic, be careful. If you see a tall, thin man with a portfolio watching your site, don't approach him. Don't try to be friendly. Call the police immediately, even if they don't believe you. Because once he's drawn your picture, once he's memorized your face, you're already marked for death. I'm leaving Texas tomorrow, heading north to Montana where my brother runs a ranch. No hospitals to build, no medical centers to expand. Maybe he won't follow me there. Maybe he'll lose interest if I'm not helping to build the places where people die. But I don't think so. I think he's already drawn my picture too. Last night I found something slipped under my front door. A folded piece of paper with my house sketched in perfect detail. Every window, every door, every hiding place carefully marked. At the bottom, that same neat handwriting. You helped them build their killing machine. Now you pay. I'm not staying to find out what that means. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But he'll still be out there, still watching construction sites, still sketching his plans, still hunting the men who build the places where his daughter died. If you see him, run. Don't be a hero. Don't try to help, just run. Because the sketch artist never forgets a face, and he never stops hunting. My truck is loaded. I'm leaving in an hour. Maybe I can outrun him. Maybe I can disappear somewhere he'll never find me. But deep down, I know the truth. You can't outrun someone who's already drawn your picture. You can't hide from someone who's memorized every detail of your face. The sketch artist will find me, just like he found Breeden, just like he found my nephew, just like he'll find you if you're not careful. Watch for him. Watch for the tall, thin man with the portfolio. And if you see him watching your construction site, pray he hasn't already started sketching. This happened a couple of years ago when I was working 2 jobs to save up for my own apartment. I had a steady 9 to 5 office job, but I also drove for a rideshare app as a way to make some extra cash whenever I had free time. I found myself putting in sometimes 30 hours a week just driving people around every evening after my day job ended. This particular night, I started driving after grabbing dinner around 6:30. It was turning out to be a really profitable evening, to be honest. I was getting a lot of good rides with decent tips, so I should have probably called it quits and given myself a break. But I was being greedy. I kept accepting rides, hoping to continue the streak of well-paying customers. By 11 p.m., things had slowed down considerably, and the last few rides I'd completed were just average fares. I really wanted to end the night on a high note, though, so I kept my app active and drove around the downtown area, waiting for something good to pop up. Finally, a ride request came through that looked promising. Almost $25 for a pickup that was only about 20 minutes away. The destination wasn't listed, which sometimes happened with the app, but the fare estimate was too good to pass up. Once I accepted the ride, I started heading to the pickup address. The roads were pretty quiet and empty at this time of night, so the drive there was smooth. However, the GPS was directing me toward an industrial section of town that I wasn't very familiar with. I double-checked the address several times, just to make sure I was going the right way. When I got to the final turn, the app directed me down a narrow access road that led between some old factory buildings. I drove slowly, looking for the exact address, until I reached what appeared to be an abandoned manufacturing plant. There was a small parking area next to a chain-link fence. I pulled into the lot and put my car in park, then looked around through all my windows. I was definitely confused. This clearly wasn't a residential area, and I didn't see anyone waiting for a ride. There was a weathered sign on the fence indicating this was some kind of defunct textile factory. I'd picked people up from strange places before late-night jobs, friends' houses in weird locations, but this felt different. Industrial areas like this were usually completely deserted after business hours. Just as I was starting to wonder what exactly I was supposed to do, my phone rang. It was the passenger. The voice on the other end was a deep, gravelly male voice that was almost hard to understand. He said he could see on the app that I'd arrived at the pickup location and asked if I could spot him. I told him no. He explained that he was working a late shift at a security company and was stationed at a building just down the access road. He said I should be able to see some lights if I drove a little further back into the complex. I said all right, figuring this explained why the fare was so high. It was an unusual pickup location. I did mention to him that the area looked pretty deserted and asked if he was sure he was supposed to be there. He assured me that his company had a contract to patrol several of these old buildings overnight. I wasn't familiar with security work, so I didn't have any reason to doubt him. I started my car back up and drove deeper into the industrial complex. I had to use my phone's flashlight to see clearly because the streetlights were either broken or non-existent back here. The access road curved between several large, dark buildings. Most of them looked like they'd been abandoned for years. Broken windows, graffiti on the walls, weeds growing through cracks in the pavement. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. Then I saw some light ahead, a yellowish glow coming from behind one of the buildings. It wasn't bright enough to be normal building lighting, more like a flashlight or maybe a small work light. Strangely, the light wasn't near the road or in any kind of obvious waiting area. It was off to the side, between two buildings where there didn't appear to be any proper walkway. I couldn't see a direct way to drive to it, so I parked my car and got out. As I walked toward the light, things started feeling really off. First of all, I didn't hear any sounds that would indicate someone was working. No machinery, no radio, no voices. Just my own footsteps, echoing off the concrete buildings. Secondly, as I got closer, I realized the light source was just a single work lamp sitting on the ground, plugged into a long extension cord that disappeared around the corner of the building. There was no one there. No security guard, no equipment, nothing that would suggest anyone was actually working. I barely had time to mutter, "What the hell?" under my breath when I heard footsteps coming from somewhere behind the building. I turned toward the sound and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a tall man with dark hair and a scruffy beard. He was wearing what looked like a security uniform, but something about him immediately put me on edge. His smile looked forced and unnatural, like he was trying too hard to appear friendly. "Sorry about that," he said in that same deep, gravelly voice from the phone. "I was checking the back entrance when you pulled up. Didn't see you walking over here." Nothing about the situation made sense. Why would a security guard be working in the dark with just a single work light? Why wasn't he near the road where a rideshare driver could easily find him? And most importantly, why did he only show himself after I'd clearly spotted the suspicious setup? I tried to respond, but I was stumbling over my words. As he started walking closer to me, my instincts kicked in, and I decided I needed to get out of there immediately. I turned and ran back toward my car as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear him calling out in this creepy, overly friendly voice, asking me to come back and saying he had cash to tip me with. His tone made my skin crawl. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door and get inside as quickly as possible. I started the engine and threw it in reverse, ready to get back to the main road. But when I reached the exit of the industrial complex, I had to slam on my brakes. There was a heavy chain stretched across the access road, blocking my way out. It definitely hadn't been there when I drove in 20 minutes earlier. I stared at the chain for several seconds, trying to decide if I could get out and remove it or find another way around. Then I heard footsteps approaching from behind my car in the darkness. I didn't even look back. I just floored the gas pedal and drove my car up onto the sidewalk area squeezing around the edge of the chain barrier. It was a tight fit because there were concrete posts on both sides, and if I'd misjudged the space, my car could have gotten stuck or damaged. Once I made it back onto the main access road, I sped away from that place as fast as I could safely drive. I didn't know what that whole setup had been about, but I was stupid not to call the police right away. Although I think by the time they would have arrived, whoever that was would have been long gone anyway. The next morning, I did some research and found out that the textile factory I'd been lured to had been closed for over 3 years. There were no active security contracts for that location, and the entire industrial complex was scheduled for demolition. To me, that confirms how dangerous the situation really was. What that person's actual intentions were, I'll never know, and it still haunts me to think about what could have happened in that abandoned factory that night if I hadn't trusted my instincts and run. I work security at a large distribution warehouse. It's located in an industrial complex on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty lots and woods. My job is pretty straightforward. I sit in the security office and monitor multiple screens showing feeds from cameras throughout the facility. If any alarms go off, or I notice something suspicious, I do walking patrols to investigate and document whatever I find. It's really simple work, and since I'm the only person there overnight, I can pretty much do whatever I want as long as I stay alert and check the monitors regularly. The warehouse stores electronics, appliances, and other high-value merchandise, so security is taken seriously. I'll admit, though, the job can get incredibly boring sometimes. By the time this incident happened, I'd already thought about quitting several times, but the pay was decent, and I needed something stable. This particular night, I arrived at the facility at my usual 10 p.m. start time. The building sits at the end of a long access road with forest on 3 sides, so there's never any traffic or people around after business hours. I parked in the employee lot and headed inside to the security office. I'd been binge-watching a crime documentary series during my recent shifts, so after doing my initial walkthrough and checking all the camera feeds, I set up my tablet and started watching where I'd left off. The warehouse typically stays quiet during overnight hours since there are no shipments or deliveries scheduled. Most nights, I might have to investigate 1 or 2 minor alarm triggers, usually just motion sensors picking up small animals or equipment settling. I think I got through about 2 episodes, so roughly 2 hours into my shift, when one of the alarm monitors started flashing. The screen showed that a motion detector in Section C had been triggered. This was in the main storage area where most of the valuable inventory was kept. I paused my show and got up from the desk. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, then headed downstairs and through the maze of corridors that connected the office area to the main warehouse floor. The storage area was massive, with towering metal shelving units arranged in long aisles throughout the space. Each section was clearly labeled with large numbers and letters. The alarm notification had given me the specific location, Section C, row 15. I walked down the appropriate aisle and made my way to row 15, which happened to be in the far back corner of the warehouse. When I reached the spot where the motion sensor had been triggered, I immediately saw what had caused the alarm. One of the security cables that ran along the shelving unit had been completely disconnected. It was hanging loose, like someone had either pulled on it deliberately or knocked into it somehow. In all my time working this job, I'd never seen one of these heavy-duty security cables just come undone on its own. They're designed to stay connected, even if the shelving units shift or settle. Still, I couldn't think of any other explanation for what could have happened. I reconnected the cable and reset the alarm system for that section. Everything appeared to be functioning normally again, and a quick visual scan of the nearby inventory didn't reveal anything missing or disturbed. I decided to do a more thorough walkthrough of the surrounding aisles while I was already down there, just to make sure everything else was secure. The warehouse was dead silent, except for the distant hum of the climate control system and my own footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. As I was finishing up my patrol and heading back toward the office area, I heard an unfamiliar sound coming from somewhere else in the building. It was like a heavy metal door slamming shut, a deep, resonating bang that echoed through the corridors. It was definitely creepy sounding, especially since there should have been no other sounds in the entire facility. Unfortunately, I didn't know the layout of the warehouse well enough to pinpoint exactly where the sound had come from. The building was enormous, and there were dozens of doors throughout the complex loading dock entrances, emergency exits, office doors, storage room access points. For all I knew, it could have been one of the large rolling doors shifting due to wind pressure or temperature changes. I made my way back to the security office and sat down at the monitor station. I checked all the camera feeds carefully, looking for any signs of movement or disturbance, but everything appeared normal. I figured whatever had made that noise was probably just the building settling, or some piece of equipment cycling on and off. I went back to watching my documentary series. Only a few minutes had passed, and I'd barely gotten through one scene when I heard what sounded like rapid footsteps moving through the corridor just outside the security office. It gave me an immediate adrenaline spike, but I quickly got up and opened the office door to look down the hallway. There was nothing there, just an empty corridor that stretched about 50 feet to another door at the far end. The footsteps had sounded like they were right outside my door, close enough that I should have been able to see whoever made them. I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate on anything else if I didn't investigate further. I walked toward the end of the corridor and opened the door. When I looked down the next hallway, I caught just a glimpse of the door at the opposite end swinging shut, like someone had just gone through it moments before I arrived. My heart started pounding. I cautiously walked down this second corridor and opened the door that I'd seen closing. This led to a section of the building that contained administrative offices, accounting, human resources, management offices, conference rooms. "Hello, is someone in here?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. I took a few steps inside. The silence was unnerving, not even the slightest sound anywhere in the building. Could someone be hiding in one of these offices? As that thought entered my mind, I started feeling genuinely unsettled. I decided not to go any further down that particular hallway. There were too many rooms where someone could be concealing themselves. I took one step back toward the door I'd come through. But just as I did, one of the office doors right next to me suddenly swung open. I only caught a brief glimpse of a figure rushing out of the darkened room before my survival instincts took over, and I turned and ran. I could hear footsteps pounding behind me as I made it back through the corridor, and into the stairwell that led to the main exit. I didn't want to risk getting trapped somewhere in the building, so I headed straight for the emergency exit and ran outside into the parking lot. Once I was near my car, I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. Whoever had been inside didn't follow me out the same exit. The police arrived quickly and conducted an extensive search of the entire facility, which took almost 40 minutes, but they didn't find anyone. The intruder had probably escaped through one of the other exits and disappeared into the woods that surrounded the property. His presence in the warehouse explained several things that had happened earlier in my shift. The security cable that had been disconnected in Section C was probably something he bumped into or pulled while moving around in the dark, trying to avoid the motion sensors. The company launched a major investigation to review all the security footage and determine how he'd gained entry and whether anything had been stolen. I wasn't given access to most of the details, since I'm just a contract security guard, not a full employee. What's clear to me, though, is that whatever this person was doing in the warehouse, he definitely didn't want me to discover him. Based on how he'd led me through multiple corridors before revealing himself, I think he was probably trying to get me isolated in a part of the building where there weren't any security cameras. How he planned to handle the situation after that, I'm fortunate enough to never have found out. I worked at Murphy's Cafe during my early 20s. It was a small 24/7 coffee shop near the university campus. Nothing fancy, really. We served basic coffee, sandwiches, and pastries to late-night students and insomniacs. The place wasn't particularly special, except for the fact that we stayed open all night, which made us a magnet for drunk college kids and night owls looking for their caffeine fix. Most nights I worked alone, and honestly, I preferred it that way. The work was straightforward: brew coffee, heat up pre-made sandwiches, and keep the place clean. During slow periods, which happened frequently after midnight, I could study for my classes or just browse my phone behind the counter. This particular Wednesday night started like any other. I clocked in at 9 p.m., taking over from the evening shift manager. There were no special instructions, no catering orders to prepare, just another quiet midweek night ahead of me. I restocked the coffee stations, wiped down the tables, and settled into my usual routine. The first few hours brought a steady trickle of customers. A few study groups grabbed late dinners, some night shift workers stopped by for their caffeine boost, and the usual collection of campus security guards made their rounds. But by 1 a.m., the place had gone completely dead. No customers, no phone orders, nothing. I was sitting behind the counter, scrolling through social media, when the motion sensor alarm chimed. It was a soft electronic beep that played whenever someone entered through the front door. I looked up from my phone and glanced toward the entrance, expecting to see a customer walking in. Nobody was there. I stood up and walked around the counter, scanning the small dining area. The tables were empty, the booths vacant. I even checked the single bathroom we had, thinking maybe someone had slipped in while I wasn't paying attention. Nothing. A small grin crossed my face as I returned to my spot behind the counter. I figured I must have been so accustomed to hearing that chime all night that my brain was starting to play tricks on me. It wouldn't be the first time a long shift had messed with my head. I settled back into my chair and didn't give it another thought. For For the next 20 minutes, the cafe remained silent. No customers, no calls, no disturbances. Then the motion sensor chimed again. This time I wasn't even looking at my phone when it happened, so I knew I definitely heard it. I immediately stood up and walked into the main seating area. But once again, I found myself staring at empty chairs and tables. Confused, I walked over to the front door and pushed it open, stepping outside onto the sidewalk. The street was completely deserted. No pedestrians, no cars in the small parking lot, not even any traffic on the road that ran past the cafe. The campus was eerily quiet at this hour. I wasn't exactly scared, but I was definitely puzzled. I spent a few minutes testing the door, trying to see if it would trigger the sensor without actually opening all the way. But every time I opened it, even just a crack, I could see the sensor light blink, confirming it was working properly. This was genuinely weird, but I didn't know what else to do about it. I decided to stay up front for a while, at least 30 minutes, waiting to see if the sensor would go off again. It never did. Eventually, I returned to my usual spot behind the counter. It was now between 2 and 3 a.m., which was always the deadest time of the night shift. Predictably, within just a few minutes of sitting back down, the sensor chimed again. This time I stayed put and listened carefully for any sounds, footsteps, voices, anything that would indicate someone had actually entered. I heard nothing but the low hum of the coffee machines and the fluorescent lights overhead. "Hello," I called out loud enough for anyone in the cafe to hear. "Is someone there?" No response. I figured whatever was causing the false alarms would sort itself out eventually, so I just ignored it and went back to my phone. Somehow, miraculously, I didn't get a single customer for the next hour. The past 4 hours had been completely dead, which was unusual even for a Wednesday night. At 4 a.m., I had to start my closing prep for the morning shift change. I walked back up to the front counter and began counting the register from the few sales I'd made earlier in my shift. But while I was there, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing up at the empty dining room in front of me, then back toward the kitchen area behind me. The sensation was strong enough that it made me genuinely uncomfortable. I told myself it was just the weird night I was having with the motion sensor acting up. I was grateful my shift would be over soon. Just another couple of minutes, and I could start the handoff process with the morning crew. Then I heard it, a distinct footstep on the tile floor behind me. The sound sent an immediate chill down my spine and made me spin around quickly. My breath caught in my throat. There was a man standing maybe 6 feet away from me. He was wearing all black torn jeans, a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, covering most of his face except for his eyes. Those eyes were what really got to me. They were bloodshot and completely vacant, like he wasn't fully there mentally. I couldn't tell if he was drunk, high, or just mentally unstable, but he clearly wasn't thinking straight. Then I noticed his right hand. He was gripping a kitchen knife so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. The blade caught the light from the overhead fluorescence. I froze completely, trying not to do anything that might set him off. After several long seconds of him just staring at me without moving, I decided I had to say something. "Listen, you can take whatever cash is in the register," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I won't call anyone or cause any trouble. Just please let me walk out of here." He didn't respond. He just stood there with that knife and that empty, 1,000-yard stare. Somehow, that made it even more terrifying. At least with a normal robber, you could predict what they wanted. This guy was completely unpredictable. The counter where I was standing formed an L shape that extended back toward where he was positioned. To get to the front door, I would actually have to run several feet toward him, around the end of the counter, then back toward the exit. With him only 6 feet away, he could easily grab me or worse if I tried. So I made a split-second decision and basically threw myself over the top of the counter. It wasn't graceful, and I hit the floor hard on the other side, but it worked. I scrambled to my feet as quickly as I could. The man was already charging at me with a look of pure rage and bloodlust on his face. I ran for the door as fast as I could and burst outside into the parking lot. I could hear him right behind me, so close that I didn't even dare try to get to my car, which was parked around back. I just kept running, making it to the main road and hoping desperately that a car might drive by and help me. At some point during my sprint, he stopped chasing me. I don't know exactly when because I was too focused on running and too afraid to look back. I pulled out my phone and called 911, then waited by the roadside for the police to arrive. It took them about 7 minutes to get there. When they searched the cafe, the man was gone. But apparently, after chasing me outside, he had gone back inside and completely destroyed the place. Every table was overturned, the coffee machines were smashed, food was scattered everywhere. He had also gone around to the back parking lot and used his knife to scratch deep gouges all along the side of my car. Looking back on it, he was probably watching me through the front windows from somewhere across the street, using the motion sensor as a way to mess with me and gauge my reactions. He was probably planning to slip inside unnoticed when I was distracted. Unfortunately for me, his plan worked perfectly, which makes me feel pretty stupid in hindsight. What's really disturbing is that there was about an hour gap between the last false alarm and when I actually saw him inside. That means he was probably hiding somewhere in the cafe that whole time, just waiting for the right moment. The strangest part is that I had no idea who this person was. I genuinely thought he was just some random psycho, but his behavior seemed oddly focused on me specifically. Maybe it was just bad luck, wrong place, wrong time kind of situation. The police never caught him. I didn't keep working at Murphy's much longer after that incident, mainly because I was terrified he might come back looking for me. Thank you for spending this time with Brad Arrows. We hope the stories whispered through the rain carried you far into your imagination or your dreams. If you're still awake, let us know how you liked the journey. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and let the darkness comfort you.